Hi, and welcome everyone to our 10th colloquium for the Good Governance Academy. I see you all coming in online now. Hi, Baba. Very nice to see you online. I know you're one of our regular attendees at the colloquium. Today, we have opened up the reactions. So if you are happy with what people are saying, please let us know. Show how you feel about what they're saying. Thumbs up, thumbs down. Excellent. Thank you so much. Please let us know where you're from. There are lots of people online today from all over the world. So in the chat function, just let us know where you're from. We have a couple from South Africa, Zimbabwe, Botswana. Wow, Southern Africa is really getting represented here. Oh, all the way from Malaysia and then to the other side of the world in New York. I see some from the UK. Wow, welcome everyone. Really lovely to have you online today. We have got the Q&A function open. So if you do have questions, please put it in the Q&A so we can pick it up, because I think there's going to be a lot of chatter today. Feel free to share any reading materials you might find of interest in the chat function so we can have a look. It's a very participative, collaborative environment we have in the colloquium. We have got lots of resources for you on the website. Those are available for download, as well as Rachel's presentation. But I know that we are eating into our time, and although we have got a 3-hour webinar today, we've got a lot to talk about. We are going to have a 5-minute break in between after the first presentations and just before our panel discussion. So you will have the opportunity to go and get a cup of tea, because 3 hours is a long time to be online. So with that, I'd like to, first of all, welcome the immediate past president of the International Federation of Accountants and our new chair, Alan Johnson. And Alan, if you can welcome us to the colloquium, that would be lovely. Thank you.
Will do. Thank you very much, Caroline, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you from wherever you are across the world. And I see that we've got lots of countries connecting. So thank you very much for that. So I'd like to welcome you to today's 10th colloquium of the Good Governance Academy. And just to say right at the outset that it was really an honor to be asked by our esteemed sort of patron, Professor Mervyn King, to take over the chair of the Good Governance Academy. As many of you will know, but I think it's worth sort of just reminding ourselves that Mervyn has been an ardent protagonist and indeed a campaigner for high quality governance, and more importantly, effective governance right across the world for over 3 decades. I mean, he has led the Eminent Persons Group of the UN Governance and Oversight. He's led the Global Reporting Initiative, the International Integrated Reporting Council, the Integrated Reporting Committee of South Africa, and of course, well known right across the world, the King Committee on Corporate Governance. So with Mervyn's very strong links with international institutions, with universities, business schools, professional bodies, and many others, Mervyn has got the attention of governments, of regulators, politicians, business leaders, and the professions to drive higher standards of governance right across the world. And it was actually Mervyn's passion that infected me first when I shared a stage with him back in London in 2006 to discuss trust and ethics in business. So in setting up the Good Governance Academy as a non-profit organization that collaborates globally and shares information on crucial business issues is a public good and of significant public interest, and aligns with many of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, particularly to the collaboration piece, which is number 17, and number 4, which is quality education. So today is the 10th colloquia, and the previous ones have included really very relevant topics, including sustainable value creation, integrated thinking and reporting, ESG, which is so topical and relevant today, creating sort of value right across society, connecting financial and non-financial information, and sustainability reporting. So today's colloquia will discuss and hopefully address the risks and opportunities of generative IT. And as we all know, there's so much about that. You've got some links, but there almost isn't a day that goes by where there is something on generative AI. It is so critically important to the whole of society, and we need to understand it, we need to embrace it, and we need to take advantage of it. I'm really delighted that we have an exciting agenda today. and an excellent panel. Rachel Johnson, who's the Global Head of Risk Management and Corporate Governance at ACCA, Dr. Andrea Bonime-Blanc, founder and CEO of GSG Risk, and Dr. Roger Miles, who is an eminent researcher, speaker, author, and moderator. Now, Mervyn will introduce the colloquium shortly, but a few words on the topic of generative AI, if I may. AI is not new, certainly not, and has been used for many years for beneficial impact. But generative AI takes it to another level and is transforming business models and making a revolutionary impact on outcomes for humanity, which includes things like human well-being, hopefully peace, and certainly prosperity for all. But there is some urgency to understand not only the opportunities of generative AI, but also the risks. The Global AI Summit, which was held, the Safety Summit, which was held 2 weeks ago in the UK at Bletchley Park, was an important step in bringing together political and business leaders, regulators, and other experts to work collaboratively to promote inclusive economic growth, sustainable development, protecting human rights and fundamental freedoms, and importantly, to foster public trust and confidence in AI systems to fully realize their potential. The summit emphasized the need for the safe development of AI to achieve the opportunities for all, including public services covering health and education, things like food security, clean energy, addressing biodiversity issues, and of course, climate. And all of these must be towards the achievement of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. Now, I've talked about some of the opportunities, but we should, of course, not ignore the risks, because these could be significant, including, unfortunately, the manipulation and the generation of deceptive content. And in the context, as we sit here today, facing a world which is significantly challenged, where the world will be facing 20, 30 political elections taking place in the next 12 to 18 months, it is so important that we ensure that citizens get the right information so they can make their choices in terms of who will be leading us going forward. Now, many of the risks associated with generative AI are inherently international in nature, and they cannot be addressed alone by any individual body or any individual country. And this is why they must be addressed through cooperation at an international level. I would also want to just quickly stress that ethics and ethical behavior are no doubt at the heart of creating a safe and controlled AI, not only in terms of creating the guardrails, but also for a better understanding of the value that AI can create. So in today's colloquium, we'll be addressing both risks and the opportunities. Now, I'm a professional accountant, so naturally you would expect me to sort of say something about the role of accountants. Professional accountants and, of course, finance professionals are trained to understand how business models work, how to assess risks and opportunities, how to ensure that there are effective controls and governance in every organization, be they public or private. And with all of our work underpinned by the Code of Ethics for Professional Accountants in order to deliver our services in an ethical way. The good thing is that corporate boards are waking up to the opportunities and the challenges from AI. And they need to have the visibility to understand how to implement AI in their businesses, how to assess the opportunities and, of course, the risks, and how to support management in such implementations, whilst, of course, importantly, remaining skeptical and providing the necessary oversight. And we all know that there are many unknowns here that we are not capable of fully comprehending or even quantifying today. And that's okay. But this means that business leaders, policymakers, and experts need to remain more alert, more vigilant, and more agile than ever before. And Rachel will no doubt discuss and cover these in the panel discussions coming up. And Mervyn will talk about responsible leadership, particularly in the corporate world, but not limited to company boards. Confidence in policymakers and corporate leaders is unfortunately at an all-time low. And we have to work very hard to restore that confidence to the right levels. As I've said earlier, we're living in a very challenging world, and we absolutely desperately need competent, effective, and visionary leadership that puts the public interest at the heart of all of the decisions that they make in order to achieve the short, of course, term and medium and long-term sustainability goals for both societies and the economies. So with that, let me now hand over to Professor Mervyn King. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan, for that welcome, and thank you for your references to my past conduct. The topic today for our 10th colloquium is, as Alan has pointed out, very important to the corporate world. AI is a transformational technology which can cause significant harm, but also significant value. So it's the risk-opportunity scenario. The National Association of Directors of the USA has seen this risk and opportunity of generative AI and has discussed it at length, which caused people like Elon Musk to come to the conclusion that it is the greatest threat to humanity, while others say it's the most wonderful aid to arrive at an informed business judgment call. So there is a risk and opportunity involved in generative AI. But what is needed, as Alan has already indicated, is responsible leadership. We have to see this generative AI as a strategic imperative and not just as an operational issue. And in order to achieve this and to have responsible leadership, the corporate leaders around the world have to make sure there's continuous technological learning about AI developments. And this should be done on a collaborative basis. And people who know me and the work I've done around the world know I believe that SDG 17 is perhaps the most important one, and that is collaboration. And we saw that with the creation of a vaccination for the COVID pandemic in 9 months instead of 9 years. And there has to be collaboration now with generative AI. So there are impacts on strategy and risk by generative AI. And we must be careful of it not tilting towards the system taking over from original intellectual thought. Because as responsible leaders of corporations, a company which is an incapacitated artificial person, and we as directors are the heart, mind, and conscience of that company, we need original intellectual thought in arriving at a decision on an issue facing the company. And the AI can be used as an aid, but mustn't replace that original intellectual thought. And maybe that's what Elon Musk was referring to. I think if companies rely on it too much and forget their duty of care, well, then there's going to be a problem. Of course, the quality of the generative AI depends on the data on which it's trained and on which we ask it for answers to certain issues. But we must be careful as responsible leaders to make sure that the AI doesn't interfere with individual privacy regulations, because it can. And it will change business models. Research around the world has shown that it's going to change organizational structures by 80%. And that conclusion was reached by the 12 largest economies being looked at, researched, involving 120 million workers who need to be retrained and reskilled over the next couple of years. which alone is a daunting task. So boards have to be constantly informed of how AI is impacting, in fact, on the organizational structure and, of course, its human capital. And it's going to be a matter of great application of mind to discharge the duty of care. Of course, the duty of care of a director to the company involves being a good guardian and a good steward of the company's assets and its business affairs. And as I said, that requires original intellectual thinking, but aided by AI to hopefully make more informed and better business judgment calls. But issues such as the business judgment rule is going to be tested during the generative AI phase as never before. If we just take some of the criteria, which when making a business judgment call and 4 years later turns out to be harmful to the company, the law is quite clear that the company has an action for damages against the directors. But the law is not an ass, and so from Delaware and then around the world developed the business judgment rule, that if you knew all the facts, the board as a collective, that they had no financial interest in the matter, and with the wisdom of hindsight, it appears to have been a rational business decision at that time in those circumstances, then the board escapes liability. Notice, not the correct decision, the rational decision. Well, did we have all the facts? The question's going to be asked, what AI aid did you use to know all the facts? So it's going to have a huge impact on those protective elements of being a director. And did we use AI aids to make sure that our decision was a rational decision in those circumstances at that time? So all these issues are going to be tested during the couple of years to come. And I hope some of these issues will be discussed by our panel and at question time. Thank you very much for attending this colloquium, and I hope we all leave more informed. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you very much, Prof. King. It's really lovely to have you online today, and thank you for opening the colloquium, the 10th colloquium for the Good Governance Academy. Just a reminder in terms of who the Good Governance Academy is, that we are an international organization, a non-profit, and we host 2 colloquia a year. And our colloquia are hosted in May and in November of every year. And this is our last one for this year. We hope to have one for you soon in May, and as many people online as we see today. Please, if people are battling to come online, you can let them know that the YouTube live stream is available, and I will put that in the chat function. But with that, I'd like to welcome Rachel Johnson, and Rachel's going to give us a presentation all around what she's seen around the world in terms of what CROs are saying and the risks, opportunities of generative AI. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. Thank you, Mervyn and Alan as well, and also to Andrea and Roger when we talk on the panel. It's always fun joining into any of the Good Governance Academy events, and also to work together on many of our shared interests. So I just have a few slides to go through, and I think Carolyn's going to pull them up. Yes, there's the first one, and I'll just ask you to go on to the next one each time. So what how I am going to address the generative AI hype, I guess I might call, of 2023 is by looking back over our massive risk culture study that has taken place over the past couple of years. So ChatGPT, the launch of that at this time last year, as well as the dramatic collapse, I think the day after or the day before, of FTX, happened literally within a couple of days of our original online survey closing. And yet, through our forums, online roundtables, and other engagements with our members around the world, we continue to gather the stories about how they are prioritizing the risks and opportunities facing their organizations today. And that includes the intriguing range of AI models, their use cases, as well as the hallucinations and necessary scenario planning around them. We also gather insights through our new risk section in ACCA's quarterly GEX survey, which allows us to collect relevant input for our new series of industry-specific reports on risk cultures and approaches to risk. Banking is the one I'm currently deep into, and because we are able to look across the different roles of the respondents, not only across the three lines and the evolving relationships between them, but also those members of ours on boards, those working for regulators, and those at third-party entities from electric payment systems and cyber consultancies to data providers. So we see the nuances and varied views up and down different hierarchies too, which really helps us gain a clearer picture of what is actually happening in practice. So when it comes to the banking sector, we know that firms have been using AI and machine learning for decades now, as Alan and Mervyn talked about, from credit modeling and scoring to streamlining and other decision-making processes, such as in loan applications, and I've heard recently even in recruitment processes. A couple days ago, I was speaking to a member of ours who is the chief risk officer at a regional bank in the US, who reminded me that there are legal frameworks already that address some of the potential biases. While he also attested that governance is at the top of every conversation when it comes to new AI use cases, he did admit that the transformation has accelerated beyond his expectations over the past year, especially with the large language models and in what they might do to make things more efficient at the bank. So, and that includes in detecting conduct risks, fraud, and other emerging risks. And that they realize there are many, many big unknowns, especially with voice and facial recognitions and the potential deep dives, for example. We also discussed the implications next year, given all of the national elections taking place around the world. So next slide, please, Carolyn. So what we see from ACCA members across sectors and around the world, what they're doing with AI through our surveys and through our roundtables and forums, but also even reading. We were talking earlier before the webinar started, just reading what companies are actually putting into their statements, what they're talking about publicly, especially as stakeholder demands and new requirements, reporting requirements, and new industry body type requirements evolve. Again, for this, my current focus in banking, I've been looking through annual reports, press coverage, and social media posts to see what some are doing, and unsurprisingly found some are really sharing a lot of specific details about their user cases, and some have reportedly nearly 1,000 or more across their global operations in use or in testing phases, including HSBC. And they cover a range of areas from, like I said, detecting financial crime and fraud to helping customers budget better and even make complaints processes faster. So we're seeing a rapid range of explorations of what it can do. Nonetheless, we see bank members, even in countries like Canada and the UK, telling us that they don't feel their customers trust the bots and prefer to stick with human interaction. So this slide really just comes from our recent Digital Horizons survey, which I urge you to look at on the ACCA website, which highlights what our members around the world, are thinking and doing about AI in general. So I see members from China to the Czech Republic talk about how they have been experimenting with AI and the LLMs to help produce reports, their financial reports more efficiently, including by finding the correct ESG data or by verifying data and processes before the external auditors do. Although the generative AI technologies are mostly still in development, technology certainly has been a major component of finance functions in banks for decades now. And of course, I've seen many fruitful talks here on other Good Governance Academy events, highlighting how some organizations can use or are currently using new technologies to address ESG matters more efficiently and more accurately. So the use case list, excuse me, continues to expand as businesses recognize that AI can lead to faster, more accurate, and of course, more profitable decisions. Unfortunately, as we will discuss today, there is a growing evidence that the use of AI for such decision-making processes can also produce unlawful, and even what Roger has said before, awful lawful, unethical, and potentially discriminatory results. So there are serious biases and data privacy issues that boards need to ensure senior management have a good grip on before any damage is done. So next slide, please. Regulatory and compliance was initially the top risk priority by a long shot and has remained in the top 3 or 4 spots in our risk culture survey since it was started at this time last year. But there is much more to this. While we clearly see a growing interest in risk culture to cope with disconnected organizational cultures and hard to detect breadth of risks, box ticking is unfortunately the way many organizations approach risk and governance, including those related to AI and ESG. One ACC member who is chair of the audit committee for a large property firm here in the UK referred to politicians as today's black swans. And we see how the tidal wave of regulatory changes that organizations face makes boards and senior management most concerned about being compliant. So it is a priority for us at the ACCA and to work with organizations, our partners like IFAC and Good Governance Academy, to collaborate and work more with the policymakers and the industry bodies to see how we can together do more to change the mindsets needed for these important green and digital transformations. Responses to one of my favorite questions in the survey, it's one of the open-ended ones, which is out quarterly, is what do you believe is the most underestimated risk facing your organization today? The responses really provide more color on what our members are concerned about when it comes to AI. And these responses are increasingly underlying the vital role of leaders in setting the tone for what the objectives are. How do we define them and plan for them? How do we define and communicate our risk tolerances too? With AI especially, we cannot forget that the other side of risk is opportunity, and there is an unavoidable tension between the two. As my friend David Koenig back in the US points out in his book, The Board Member's Guide to Risk, organizational survival requires risk-taking. And he likes to talk a lot about, very enthusiastically, about positive risk-taking. And one of my favorite quotes from the book is, if your organization is not innovating, you are simply waiting to go away. We have an article about where boards can start when it comes to understanding the organization's AI's risk and opportunities that Carolyn has put into the chat box. And there's also another one in there from Andrea, one of our panelists today, about how exponential tech requires exponential governance. And I'm sure she will touch on the superb action points she discusses in that article. So what do our members think about, or what do they think are the most underestimated risks associated with AI? I have to say that throughout 2023, they all have been increasingly focused on leadership risks. We've seen a steady decline in the trust of boards and senior management's ability to be clear with staff and other stakeholders about what their objectives or use cases are. And I might add that I've seen some of these comments come from board members themselves. Let me share a few from our second and third quarter responses. One ACCA member from New Zealand in the second quarter this year said, the underestimated risk at our organization is the potential market disruption caused by AI to parts of our customer base and our sheer lack of readiness for the impacts. Another member in Pakistan said, there's no clear plan for adaptability of technological advancements with AI. Another member in Saudi Arabia, where, by the way, we see tremendous investment in AI, well, investment flowing all over the region on AI, from what our members tell us. This person says, it's skills and capability shortage across the sector, across all levels, including the board. And another member in Scotland added to this, we simply do not have the tech and governance skill sets that can meet our stakeholders' changing demands, including what our customers want. So we see a growing concern about internal human control over the algorithms, for example, as well, those used to determine who receives insurance, loans, and jobs, like I mentioned. And one clear trend that I see is the fact that there simply are not enough governance people in the world to go around to fill these roles. There are not enough employees trained in governance, risk, and compliance out there to help push the right questions as these green and digitalization transformations sweep in. So as Professor King has explained, we need to talk more about the roles and the responsibilities. We need to think about where accountability lies. And as our calls to action in my risk culture study addresses, good governance starts with role clarity. Boards must ensure there is clear distinction between responsibility and accountability. Also, training on all levels in organizations is key, and what I say, king. So the next slide, please, Carolyn. Like with sustainability over several years, we saw during the AI summit here in the UK a couple of weeks ago how there's bound to be a tidal wave of reaction through regulation and new standards coming out. But we also see how risk cultures can help steer organizations in the right directions as all this change flows in. Because like climate and its economic and social implications, AI has no geographical boundaries. Everyone is affected or will be. As we explained, culture does eat strategy for breakfast, and we concluded that with today's risk landscape, even a weak risk culture can be better than none. The real work must start from the top. The board has a fiduciary duty to create that North Star, to define the plan of action for their organization. So what can our organization achieve with AI? Excuse me, and where shall we prioritize that? But most of all is how do we get conversations, excuse me, but most of all, how do we get the conversations about the impacts, the ethics associated with AI? How do we get all of these issues elevated up and cascaded down the organization? This really is the secret sauce of a successful risk culture. Everyone needs to be involved. And Roger, Dr. Roger Miles, is here today on the panel. He will elaborate more, I'm sure, just how we do that. He is a member of the special interest group I created for our risk culture study and continues to help us empower ACCA members to drive risk culture in all their different roles and guises. Andrea, who also contributed so much expertise and advice for our risk research, will also delve into the critical thinking needed for these complex transformations. Again, I've given Carolyn a list of links to the risk culture report, which includes the calls to actions, the podcast, as well as various AI guidelines from ISO, UNESCO, and others. So you can investigate the different initiatives out there as you bring your governance up to speed and build a risk culture that can help your organization be where it wants to be. So next slide, please. As we unraveled the overconfidence of some of our survey responses, including those who are actually, the responses from those who are actually in charge of risk, our calls to action really did emphasize the importance of speaking a common language. When bosses engage and talk about mutual interests that are critical to the organization, such as KPIs, people feel safe and more involved in matters that ultimately affect them too. A risk culture without that mutuality is a recipe for mediocrity at best. Many of our respondents, including those in senior management, also say in their answers that the tone from the top is a cliche that has lost a lot of meaning since COVID. So today we can touch on that, how that potent tone from the top really is. And I know the panelists will touch on how AI and other technologies should be embraced when we think about expectations of what a risk culture can do during times of rapid change. The power of questioning and looking in the mirror are so underestimated. And what about tone from the middle? You can't just have your senior management and the board talking about how we've got it all under control from the top. How you convey the attitudes and beliefs about risks and opportunities and get that communicated to the rest of the staff is the question. While we cannot dispute the fact that every risk is driven by a human behavior and how culture breeds those behaviors, it is so difficult to work out how you do reward someone for contributing to a good culture. And while this is discussed in our report and more in the industry deep dives I'm working on, I'm excited to get our teeth into these issues with the panelists today too. Through our engagement with members around the world, we have found shadow boards and mid-level committees to make profound differences. And I will say that if there's one thing that any of our members working on AI say they are most focused on, it is the outcomes. And you won't get outcomes unless you have different stakeholders, different backgrounds, experiences, indeed ages as well, coming together on this. And again, when we talk about boards and other leaders, we aren't just talking about that cognitive diversity, which a lot of us have been discussing in our work, but we're also talking about competence. Thank you, Carolyn. The last slide now. So with the powerful impacts and no doubt existential risks that all these technological breakthroughs may have on society at large, we can see how this paradigm shift requires collaboration, not only with industry bodies, communities, academics, dedicated charities, think tanks, and suppliers, including the small to medium enterprises that make up the bulk of our global economy, but also, again, the people in your organization. You need their input and their collaboration if you are to manage this amazing transformation wave wisely and reap the benefits. So we have talked about how humans and machines make different decisions in our Global Forum for Governance, Risk, and Performance sessions recently. And we even played with ChatGPT to see what makes an effective risk manager. We also prompted ChatGPT to tell us what the fiduciary duties of boards are. And while we at first found it pretty well put and well articulated, some of us encountered of what we thought were fake citations and references to made-up papers, and we're trying to double check. As Mervyn may recall from one of our last meetings, as he's an honorary member of this global forum, we talked a lot about the ethics of accounting and the roles of accounting professionals to be doing the proper due diligence needed in today's world. And I mean due diligence, not in a traditional way that's fit for purpose for these types of complex situations we're living in today. Ethics is no doubt at the heart of creating safe and controlled AI, not only in terms of creating the guardrails, but also in understanding the value it can create. So how can we understand how business models are affected, and how can we get everyone, not just the accounting professionals, to adhere to a code of ethics in the organization, to ensure they are rolling out their products and services in the way they desire and in a way that is in line with their values, their stated values? How do we ensure transparency and accountability of how AI applications are being used in the organization itself and the processes, ensuring there is human control, not least on the data going in and what it puts out, but are we measuring and incentivizing the risk culture we want by making sure everyone owns it and benefits from it? I'm going to end on one anecdotal note about what Roger addressed in his episode of our Risk Culture podcast series, when he said accounting professionals, at the least in all their different roles, have a very important role of foraging for the truth, something he said he learned from his friend in the Foreign Office. We were at an event here in London yesterday talking about this again, and how with the rapid transformation, auditors in particular need not only that professional skepticism spice that they are tasked to have, but also curiosity and inquisitive thinking too. And I think after this discussion, we should all think about how we all really need that today. So thank you very much, Carolyn.
Thanks very much, Rachel. It's really food for thought. Thank you very much. I think at Thank you, everyone, for applauding. Great reactions. We do have a problem with our access, so please, if people can't access, point them towards the YouTube webcast. We are monitoring that, and we will bring the questions in to here. But I think without going to a break, perhaps, Rachel, we can start the panel discussion. And would you like to maybe start with understanding what people online want to, what their problems are with Gen AI? Maybe we can open a poll.
Yeah, I think we should start with our first polling questions to help set the scene.
So I think we're starting to get some answers now. I'll let it run. We have a lot of people who are saying that they don't use AI. That's quite interesting, and I think it's something that the panel will be speaking to. I'll let it run for another couple of seconds, but perhaps Rachel, you'd like to introduce the panel.
Yes, I know they both have long distinguished bios, which are on the invite, and but I will say Andrea is founder and CEO of GEX Risk Advisory, a strategic governance risk, ESG, ethics, tech and cyber advisor to businesses, NGOs, and government. And in my view, she really is the person who coined the whole ESGT thing. And so she does these annual mega trends that she can talk about in her answers as well. And she's also authored a book called Gloom to Boom, How Leaders Transform Risk into Resilience and Values. Roger, he researches and engages with many kinds of firms about how people perceive risk and make decisions under uncertainty. As I mentioned, he really was our behavior at risk specialist on this special interest group. He works closely with corporate and public sector boards to overcome design weaknesses in risk and control governance. And his famous book, Culture, Audit, and Financial Services, was also, like Andrea's, referenced in the Risk Culture Report. So do we see what the results are before I pitch my first question to Andrea? Let's see. Oh, wow, you're right. Over half don't use AI. And the real question is, they're saying that about their organization, but maybe their organization is and they don't know it. So I'm going to start with Andrea first. As I said, you pointed out before in your annual ESGT mega trend reports, how AI applications are not new. So can you explain from your technological expertise and point of view how we have got where we are today since ChatGPT was launched this time last year? Generative AI and large language models have become so incredibly powerful just so fast, and before we knew it, cheaper and easier to use. So what are some of the examples of what can be done now that wasn't possible a year ago? And have we learned anything from earlier uses on how to ensure these new adoptions are contained in safe and ethical ways?
Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you, Carolyn and Professor Mervyn and Professor Chairman Allen, and of course, Roger. It's really great to be with everyone. And first of all, I want to correct you, Rachel. I am not a technologist. That's one of the things I often say off the bat. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a mathematician, but I do come at this from a governance, a risk, ethics, and also impact or sustainability lens, things that I've practiced over the years. And so I've always had an interest in what's next. And I did co-write a book about AI 6 years ago, almost 7 years ago now, because it was starting to become an important part of just business, and certainly governments are using it and others. And so the real change that has taken place over the last year is this idea of going from AI to exponential AI, or from being able to deploy very vast amounts of information and data, and putting them into algorithms and software and what have you, to really going exponential. And as you mentioned earlier, I like to think of this whole array of issues, both the opportunities and the perils, as requiring exponential tech, requiring exponential responsibility. And that means governance, it means better risk management, it means putting ethics in the process early and often, and really rethinking how we do things. And so what's happened in the last year with ChatGPT is that we've gone from the regular AI that allows us to do this enormous amount of data manipulation and what have you, to what people are calling reinforcement learning from human feedback. It's RLHF, just in case you needed another hard to say acronym. And what ChatGPT and all of its brethren and sisters, I guess, is that have popped up over the last year, whether it's Llama from Meta, there's something called Vicuña, there's Bard, there's a whole bunch of bots that are basically ChatGPT-like bots that have been thrown into the wild. And what that means is anybody who uses them potentially at their peril. And there are real downsides to using things that you don't know where the data is coming from. You don't know where the quality of the data is. And at the same time, it's this amazing ability to talk to your computer and it talks back to you. And that wasn't happening 2 years ago, at least not to the general public. And so to me, that's one of the big changes. And what we see, for example, I'll use a couple of use cases. I saw in a demonstration recently that about a year ago, when ChatGPT just came out, if you wanted DALL-E, which is the graphics and visuals version of the generative AI, if you wanted it to draw a picture of a redheaded girl in the countryside, you would get this crazy sort of cartoon-like depiction from the generative AI. A few months later, it came up as a pretty nice cartoon, not a crazy sort of Modigliani kind of cartoon. And a few months ago, you had a perfect person, perfect countryside. You could not differentiate between the AI created version and a real version. And so that underscores one of the big perils of AI, generative AI, which is deep fakes are going to get faker and harder to separate out from reality. We know that from visuals, we know that from audio, we know that from pictures. And that's the other important distinction that the generative AI space is showing, which is it's not just about large language models and text, but it's also about visuals. It's also about audio. And so we have a whole array, think of any aspect of life, whether it's the audit function in your company, whether it's other functions or operations, whether it's the development of products and services, whether it's something that governments do. Everything that has infused generative AI in it is going to be turbocharged for good, for bad, for ugly. And so one of the things, and stop me when you want to stop me, Rachel, because I could go on. But one of the things that we really need to think about, and I think it was very interesting to see the poll showing 52% at least don't think that they're using generative AI. One of the things that we have to constantly think about, a mantra, is humans in the loop. And so when we get scared about our jobs are going to go away, or I won't have anything interesting to do, or the whole business model will be disrupted, there is a role for humans no matter what. And I think what we are being challenged with as human beings and as professionals is, how do we keep up with this incredible exponential rate of change? How do we adapt ourselves? And it's very hard. I mean, humans don't like change, generally speaking. Some of us like it because we're kind of in the business of figuring out what's going on and what are the future roles. But humans in the loop is an extraordinarily important part of this. And that means that you as an auditor need to not only understand the generative AI tools that might be useful to your own job and adapt and incorporate that into your thinking, but you need to understand how it's crept into all aspects of your business. And so as an auditor, you need to understand what is going on in the development of your products and services. Are people looking at the ethics issues, the bias issues, the discrimination issues, the bad data quality issues? Are they looking at, the things that could go wrong? And also, are they taking advantage of the things that could go right? And so you as an auditor and as an accountant or as a financial professional really need to understand how it affects your potential professional situation and adapt to it, but then also be a value-added contributor to your business, your, whatever it is that you're doing, your professional activities. And I think that's the humans in the loop piece, plus really understanding that we are in an era of continuous change and dramatic change. And whether we like it or not, we need to at least keep up and at best, adapt and contribute to more ethics in the process, more human values in the process, making sure that we're not allowing harm to take place. So those are some very big picture things. I'll just mention a few sort of use cases just off the top of my head for purposes of also sort of teeing up the conversation a little bit. We see generative AI in assistance now. We have non-human assistants that are starting to creep into all of our work. If our businesses, sometimes bigger businesses, have developed their own, there are now the Microsoft Copilot and a few others are doing things that allow you to interact with your bot in your, computer, your Outlook, your whatever it is that you're deploying on your own computer. And again, the pros and the cons. There's great productivity pros here. There's potentially serious privacy cons. And also, other potential consequences. In the health industry, the deployment of generative AI is going to do amazing things, if it hasn't already, detecting cancers, other diseases, because it sees patterns at a volume that doctors will never see. We have autonomous vehicles, we have drones, we have all of these robotic kinds of things that are now infused with generative AI and will be deployed for even more serious, both productivity and good things, and serious dangers and perils. And all I need to say is we have a couple of wars going on around the world. Drones are being used. I'm sure generative AI is being used in some of those deployments. And I'll stop with one more example, which I think touches all of us, which is the entertainment industry. We've just come out of two major strikes in the United States, Hollywood related, one for actors and the other for screenwriters. And the whole issue there may have been a few others, but the biggest issue there was AI replacing the actors and AI writing the script. So, and by the way, the humans won in this particular case, but stay tuned for future developments.
Thanks so much, Andrea. And also, just when we were met in New York and had lunch, it was great. You were telling me all with all your experience on boards and so on, given all of these risks swirling and everything happening fast, how important it is to, at the board level, to prioritize things more than ever. And also, I remember you mentioning too, just how important it is. And I tried to get that message across too, that with these innovations, it's important that we're all being educated. So not just the top of the towers. It's in it for everyone. So Roger, I'll just turn to you next. You've been talking about the human perceptions of risk and AI disruption with me since we met before ChatGPT came out. So I hoped you could talk first on how do we align human values with the machines, or how do we learn how to contain them in the way that we intend? And I thought, for example, maybe you could tell us or describe what you see happening today versus what you think might be happening even a year or two from now, in terms of how we address the emerging scenarios over those time increments, different stages of development. And also maybe touch on, for this audience, if they haven't listened to your podcast, those sort of analogies you pointed out with the printing press and the
Sure.
Railway Express.
Yeah, happy to. Thanks, Rachel. And by the way, what an absolute privilege to be on this platform. Fabulous co-contributors here and a really interested audience. I can see the questions pouring in already. Okay, so look, just a quick bit of background. I won't give you the whole back history of my career any more than everybody else's, but I did for a long time teach in one of the universities the perception of risk. How do we make sense of risk? And as part of that, I was interested in how can we better inform decisions around gathering of knowledge, sorting of data, what we can see instinctively as humans that possibly can't be seen through formal risk capture and data processing approaches. So I've always been interested in this idea that humans have some access to a dimension of perception that possibly machines don't. And when you look at the history of AI, I guess the original reference point that we all need to be aware of, and I don't know how many people have sort of looked into the background of this, there's a thing called the Turing test, which is named after the famous British scientist Alan Turing, who famously cracked the German secret high command code in the Second World War, built what's widely regarded as the first functional computer. And he said there will be a future in which machines will catch us up in intelligence. And so the test that I propose is, I want you to imagine that you're an interviewer and you're interviewing a candidate, and the candidate entity, whatever it is, whether it's a person or a machine, is sitting behind a screen. So you can't see that, you get no visual cue as to whether it's a person or a machine answering your questions. And if the conversation flows freely to the extent that you can't tell if it's a person or a machine, or indeed if you think it's a person, but it turns out to be a machine, then the machine has passed the human cognition test. So it is as if it is a human being. Now, I'm fascinated having conversations with my new friend ChatGPT-4 over the last couple of months, that it gives a very, very good impression of being a human being. I get it to interview me and test some, things that I'm writing and so on. Very often it will ask really intelligent questions, except when it doesn't. And I've realized, we were at a conference, Rachel and I, with a bunch of bankers yesterday, and somebody on the platform said of generative AI, which I thought nailed it brilliantly. It's like a newly arrived research student on your team, who's maybe they're not a graduate yet, maybe they're a kind of fresh out of school undergraduate, they're looking at gathering information. They're really enthusiastic to capture all the information and to kind of stick post-it notes all over the wall of all this stuff that they know, but they have no great capacity to analyze and absolutely no capacity to synthesize. That is, to gather all the data collectively and infer and induce and draw thoughtful, empathetic human conclusions from it. So the best analogy I can think of, and I always try and reduce these things, you know me, Rachel, to the schoolyard. The best mental construct of generative AI I can offer you is, it's like building a house out of Lego bricks, little building bricks. So generative AI basically just keeps on producing little bits of conversation. You want to call them morphemes or whatever we talk about in linguistics, little units of meaning. But essentially, it's just attaching little units of meaning to other units of meaning, a little bit like a child building a Lego house. And it has no concept of what the shape of the house is going to be. It just, when it's ended up with something house shaped, it stops building. So that is the limit of its perception. However, and I will get back to some of your simple analogies in a second, but again, I want to share with you something that I shared with a conference of asset managers last week. I don't know how many among the hundreds in the group attending today, how many of you are aware of what a petaflop is? I'm willing to bet maybe 2 out of 500 will know already what a petaflop is. It's a unit of computation. So it's essentially how fast, look into, in terms of the thing that's inside your head, your brain in a resting state is running, and I'm not, by the way, a petaflop scientist, but somebody told me it's around 18 petaflops is the resting state of processing speed of your human brain. Now, that's not just a randomly plucked figure, because the power of compute, that is the hardware and software that drives generative AI, last year broke through the 18 petaflop barrier. It was physically not attainable for computers to think that fast. Even the fastest supercomputers, up to about 5 years ago, were nowhere near the associative processing speed of the human brain. We have this wonderful instrument in all our heads. Depressingly, I'm afraid, the higher processing rate, so the human brain acting at full speed, kind of like me now with you, the higher rate of brain is about 24 petaflops. Now, to give you some indication, that's like a figure 10 with, I think, 24 zeros after it per second of unit processing, just to give you a rough idea of what we're talking about here. So your brain is this fantastic associative machine that just freely gathers information, processes it subconsciously and consciously, chucks it out again. The computer will break through that processing threshold, so the upper limit of the human brain's capacity, by end of year 2024. And I can share with you offline charts which show that essentially these lines are converging like this. Now, going back to what Andrea was saying about multiple spikes in processing, you may have come across in the environmental field the term the hockey stick. You know, the idea that we've got slow change that acts maybe over decades or centuries, and the sort of incremental change. But the hockey stick moment is when incremental change suddenly just flips and goes exponential. Again, whereas amongst a group of accountants, so I don't need to explain the difference between exponential and slowly additive. What we have here is these exponential kick-ups happening simultaneously in more than 10 different fields. So not just computing, but healthcare, creative services, capacity of machine learning. That this gives us lots of great useful outputs. One of the things that I love as an auditor myself in a previous life is we can now do what has eluded the audit profession for its entire history. We can do a 100% audit. So just consider something with a very, very high quantum of data going through it that needed to be checked, but we couldn't check it before. My go-to example, just because it's my industry, is the banking industry, where imagine you've got a global bank with voice traders, so people making contracts using microphones, voice boxes on their desks. A voice trader may be working a 10-hour day, typically in a currency or a derivatives market. You've got maybe, I don't know, 2,000 voice traders in London. You've got another 2,000 in Wall Street. You've got another 4,000 in Singapore. And I know. So each bank may well have, let's keep the numbers simple, 5,000 voice traders who are active for a 10-hour day each day. Now, I don't know if you've ever looked at when you've taken a voice memo on your phone. It's around, I think it's like a megabyte of data for every 10 minutes of trading in terms of the data capture of your voice, which remember is an unstructured data source. Your voice is just a continuous spooling, noise-making machine. It doesn't sort of neatly divide up into data quantities, which a machine can immediately peel out and analyze. So you have to have complete capture of your voice, and imagine that multiplied by 5,000 traders, by 10 hours a day, by, let's say, 250 days trading a year, by whatever that figure was, a megabyte per 10 minutes. Just the sheer quantity of data is unfeasibly massive to manage. And yet AI, as of now, can take all of those terabytes worth of data, not just listen, but it can do now what has previously eluded the banking industry, which is to spot patterns of misconduct at the early stage of their developing. Now, this may not be your special subject, so I won't go into a lot of detail, but one of the classic tells for traders who are about to go outside the safe corridor is they do what we call code switching. Now, code switching is something that's used in social science a lot to describe the different sorts of vocabulary that we use at work or at home, or with maybe close family versus sort of wider public realm. Code switching for traders can take the form of, we had an example yesterday, traders who are working in Spanish switching into Italian, or traders who are trading in Italian switching into Portuguese. Now, these are languages which are in some ways close, in some ways not so close, but classically really, really difficult for an auditor to spot. If you were a Spanish-speaking auditor, you wouldn't necessarily immediately pick up on something switching to Italian. So a voice trading analysis, of these hours and hours of unstructured data, an auditor would classically listen to maybe a sample random selection of sort of 5 minutes from this day, and then 5 minutes from another day, and 5 minutes from another day. Clearly, it's not going to capture any sort of devious behavior. The chances of even, knowing what you're listening to are not necessarily that great. This machine, this AI, can listen to an entire year's worth of voice trade tapes, and it can say, right, this trader in Rio and this trader in Rome and this trader in Hong Kong are colluding because they switch languages, they maybe go to a WhatsApp group, and then they do an off-market trade, or they use some gray space to do the trade. Now, that I think is absolutely fantastic, and that gives us the prospect of getting on top of money laundering, off-market trading, insider dealing, grey market exploitation, all this kind of stuff, which in finance has eluded us, frankly, forever. And I think that's absolutely wonderful. So let's be clear about that. But let me give you another example, which is a bit more, let's say, in the grey area for our own perception. So I was talking to an asset manager at a gig last week, and she said, I love AI because it used to take me most of a working day. It used to take me sort of 6 or 7 hours to write a client proposal, to write a proposal for a high net worth individual who's looking to switch their assets and maybe be more ESG friendly, change their risk profile or whatever. I had to go through all that question, analysis, profile shaping, selection of funds, and so on and so on. She said, that used to take me 6 hours. It now takes me 20 minutes. To which my response was, that doesn't feel like long enough to me. Can you honestly say you had a conversation and you know your client well enough that simply getting, our friend ChatGPT to, as it were, kind of pluck a load of stuff off the wall and stick it into admittedly beautifully shaped, clearly worded, sequentially laid out document, is that the same thing as actually considering your client's needs? Or is it just getting a machine to, again, to take my previous analogy, peel off all those sticky labels that the researcher has put on the wall and sort of file them into an alphabetically correct order? Now, I don't want to rubbish generative AI because it's exceedingly clever. But the problem that we have as humans is because it passes that Turing test that I talked about, because it can sustain a conversation, because it can give the appearance of answering a question, we've got to be incredibly careful. It's not actually answering the question. My asset management friend who said, wow, I've got 6 clear hours a day now. What do I do with all this extra time? Maybe think a bit harder about client service. Don't defer to the machine so utterly. Which brings me to the core problem that I really want to talk about with you today, and that is tech utopia. Now, for many, many years, technologists have sold us on the idea that the technology, because it now exists, is going to make our lives better. The simple existence of the technology will make our lives better. Let's just take 3 simple examples. Antibiotics, discovered, I'm thinking, in the 1900s, 1920s. Turned into mainstream medicine in the earlier parts of the 1930s, 40s of the 20th century. Fantastic. We can now operate. People could go into hospital. They can have, open surgery on parts of their body, and we can kill the bacteria, which previously posed a really serious hazard that a lot of people who went in for quite straightforward operations died on the table because they contracted infections, which we couldn't counteract. So antibiotics, fabulous invention, completely changed healthcare. And we had over a century where antibiotics worked flawlessly, and the people who would have died from infection simply didn't. And, a triumph for healthcare. Except, of course, bacteria don't work like that. Bacteria are constantly evolving, and it's like an arms race. So we invented what we thought was the knockout blow, but actually it wasn't. And we now have so-called MSRAs, so medication-resistant bacteria. If you give somebody an antibiotic when they go into the operating theatre, there is now a chance that they might die of the same thing that killed your great-grandfather before antibiotics were invented. So that's one. Let's take another one. The invention of autonomous transport, let's call it the motor car. Fantastic idea, right? It gave people the freedom to travel, to have different patterns of work, visit remote relatives, all of that wonderful freedom that the motor car industry advertised very heavily throughout the 20th century, except now it turns out there's a problem with pollution and the planet and mass overconsumption of oil and fossil fuels. Also, if you happen to live in a busy city, as I do, if you try getting in your car and going anywhere, you're actually now moving at a slower speed, again, than your great-grandparents did in the 1900s when they went to work on a horse. So, is the motor car necessarily a technology that has improved the quality of our lives without other social penalties? Clearly not. Let's take one more, talking about transport again, the invention of air travel. Fantastic. We can get all over the world. We can fly around the world in not much more than 24 hours. The airliner is a wonderful invention. It's like a bus that takes you in the sky in super quick time to other places. Now, leaving aside pollution for just a minute and leaving aside the extremely effective risk control profile of the aviation industry, big success story, by the way. Planes used to crash or hit each other very frequently. Now the chances of that risk event happening are, infinitesimally small compared with where they were a generation ago. So air transport, fantastically safe. And yet, cast your mind back to 9/11. I'm sorry, this is an unpleasant kind of example, but it's really important. This super safe, effective, humanity transforming technology was co-opted and, as we call it, malignly repurposed, so used by bad actors to transform what was previously a completely, or next to a completely safe object with a huge social benefit, to turn it into a flying bomb capable of destroying high-rise buildings. So every technology that's invented presents opportunities, but also presents malign opportunities. And here's the thing, those opportunities are not foreseen by the people who invented the technology. And that brings me full circle back to AI. You have this massively powerful, calculative, pattern spotting, problem solving machine. But, and I'm just going to pause here, I appreciate I'm getting into this. Talking of aviation, there's a very useful piece of risk science referred to by people like me and Andrea as normal accident theory, invented by a professor called Charles Perrow back in the 80s. And it says, where you have a large complex system where there are multiple interactions and, complex calculations and lots of kind of this complex system talking to this other complex system, what Perrow says is it is inevitable that at some point there's going to be an interaction between these two complexity generators, which will create something which was wholly unforeseeable. Now, Chick Perrow was talking about, as we then called it in aviation, a thing called fly-by-wire, which some of you might remember vaguely, which was the first time that pilots could control the ailerons, the machinery of the plane, without physically having to move things. They moved a joystick, which was then controlling a computer, which was then talking to another computer, which was then generating the movement in the tail fin or whatever. So the actual movement was not the pilot doing this thing directly mechanically connected, but a computer signaling to another computer, which was then reproducing the signal in the mechanical form at the other end. Straight after fly-by-wire was introduced to aviation, there was a series of spectacular accidents, including one at the Paris Air Show, where the fly-by-wire malfunctioned and drove the plane into the ground. Now, predictably, the airline industry's response was to say pilot error. But after the usual sort of recriminations and public investigations and so on, it turned out, yes, it was a machine effect. It was a complex communication error, which was from an unforeseen exchange between two computers. Now, let's talk about generative AI taking that model into consideration. Generative AI is producing a greater quantity of information than the entire human collective brain has produced in its entire history. We are already at a stage, less than, let's say, 2 years into this new generation of generative AI, where the quantity of stuff coming out of the machine is by a factor of 2 or 3, and in future by a factor of 10, 15, a million, greater than anything we can produce. So the consequences of this for making sense of the world, making sense of risk, are absolutely enormous. And the only event I can compare this to in human history is the advent of the printing press. So you think your way back to the early 15th century. If you wanted to acquire knowledge, you had to borrow or write or copy a book. Now, I don't know if you know anything about book production in the 1400s, but essentially it took a team of 50 monks 2 months to create a book. Then fast forward to the advent of the printing press with Mr. Gutenberg and his friends. They could create the same book in maybe a day or two. Fast forward to the 20th century, high-speed printing, desktop publishing, and all that. I can write a book and it can be on the shelf within 2 weeks. I wish I could, by the way. Generative AI can write an 80,000-word novel in 5 minutes, if that's what you want. Does that mean that it's going to be a novel worth reading? Probably not. I have a number of friends who work in the creative services industry who are really deeply concerned about this. Andrea mentioned the writer's strike. Because you can write a thing that looks like a screenplay, does it mean it's actually a movie that anyone wants to watch? Well, at the moment, no. one of the challenges from the writers' strike was to producers who said, well, hang on a minute, we can set out a sequence of plot points, we can set out how to write dialogue, we can ask the GPT machine to emulate different characters. And one of the wonderful things about ChatGPT is you can ask it to talk to you like a kid. You know, if you're going to give a complex talk on a specialist subject, you can say, I'd like to address this to a class of middle schoolers, and I want you, GPT-4, to ask me the questions that the middle schoolers would ask. I find that a really useful training aid. I do it all the time. But they won't necessarily be thoughtful and connected questions. And if you're writing a screenplay, what you won't end up with is a screenplay that actually has narrative flow, or still less, empathy, hooks, things that challenge you to pay attention, stay emotionally invested in the characters. Because GPT doesn't do empathy. Again, it can simulate it. But going back to our friend Alan Turing and the Turing test of the bot behind the screen, GPT is not quite there yet. If you talk to it for long enough, and in my experience, after about a 10-minute conversation, once you've had the first 3 exchanges, which it passes pretty well, you begin to notice there's a degrading of the quality of interaction. And pretty soon, you know you're not talking to a person, you know it's a machine. Now, of course, that's not a great experiment because you know, because the screen says ChatGPT-4 on it. But I could encourage, if you want to, there's some software you can plug in where it'll actually just talk to you like a person with a voice. And you can make that voice, you know, the voice of any actor. Also spooky, by the way. So let's be really careful that we're not, according to this machine, and it is a machine, greater humanity or greater intellect than it actually has. Now, Andrea and Rachel, indeed, I probably haven't answered the question quite, but does that give you enough of a curtain raiser for us then to go on and talk about functional, productive things, you know, what's good and what's bad? I haven't even started, by the way, on bias psychology, which is why I think I'm really in the room. And so just to leave you with the thought, perhaps to us to return to, that one of the wonderful things about human beings is we are super evolved monkeys, essentially. We do need to acknowledge this. Our brains at one level, if you dig into the middle of the brain, the amygdala, we still have this wonderful set of response bias activities which tell us to behave in a certain way: fight, flight, feed, you know, drink, chase the hostile animals away, or whatever it is. All that stuff that our primitive brain tells us to do, brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. Unfortunately, it also leads us astray. It creates, and there are over 200 documented bias effects, some of which we may even talk about later. It makes us respond in ways which are not rational, which are irrational. Let's call them emotionally needy, affective, so substituting anger or emotion, you know, substituting emotion for rational decision making. Wonderful thing about humanity that it can do that, both for good, but there's a dark side to it, of course, which is we make assumptions, we stereotype. In order to conserve mental energy, we pigeonhole things into kind of easy place. Oh, that looks like this, that's analogous to that, let's park it over here. But actually it can be a false analogy, and so we make a wrong decision. One of the classic tests that I saw recently with generative AI in picture form, so DALL-E, was asked by some people researching gender stereotyping to produce a series of pictures, rendered pictures of various occupations. And it was asked to draw a photoreal picture of a nurse. Guess what? The nurse was female and young and white. It was asked to draw a picture of a terrorist. The terrorist was a swarthy-skinned person with a beard and a turban. It was asked to draw a picture of a CEO. The CEO was a 40-something balding white man. Now, this is the AI left entirely to its own devices, just asked to say, render me a picture of what you as a collective, you know, you as humanity, or what the stuff you've read, draw us a picture of the thing that you have in mind when I just give you this notional idea. What it went for was not just the stereotype, but an amped up, reinforced stereotype every single time. Now, if we're serious about cognitive diversity, tackling discrimination, opportunity, social mobility, education, all that stuff, generative AI, I'm sorry, people, is not going to help us. It's actually going to make it worse rather than better. I'm going to stop there because that's enough provocations to get us started, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, thank you, Roger. It's always good, extremely important food for thought. And I was thinking about the book by Mustafa Suleyman, the co-founder of DeepMind and Inflection AI. The book is called The Coming Wave, and he talks about how knowledge has been the main engine of progress for our entire civilization, but at the same time, and how the next generation, this generation, will be the most productive in the history of our species, but at the same time, how it's going to initiate huge decentralizing forces, which will have the potential to undermine, the current way we operate. And
let me just put another little provocation there. Why do people form companies and work together? Is it just to make stuff, or is there also a bit of a social element in that? I mean, we saw this post-COVID. I've had so many conversations with big financial firms around, let's all go hybrid, let's work from home because we save massively on our property footprint. What could go wrong? And you know what? 2-3 years later, everyone is now saying, hey, it's really good to come back to the office. Why? Because human contact, not just for exchange of information, but also, this is so, so important. And again, machines don't do this, for serendipity. Just randomly running into people and thinking, having ideas, having a coffee with that person you don't normally work with. Oh, what's going on in your department? You can call it gossip, you can call it anecdote gathering. By the way, some of the greatest leaders in history used anecdote gathering as one of their primary risk sensing tools. So I was talking at this at a history do last week. Napoleon Bonaparte, okay, may not be one of your great heroes, but the fact is the guy conquered most of Europe, and we all spoke French almost at one point. Bonaparte used to do this thing of disguising himself as a foot soldier and just walking around the camp at night, chatting randomly to his frontline staff, as we now call them. Somebody else in the modern age who does that, who may or may not be a hero of yours, depending on where you stand in terms of corporate enterprise, Jeff Bezos does the same thing. Bezos says, and by the way, whatever you think of the guy, for the things that he does and the enterprises on, you can't disagree that Amazon has had, a globally fundamental, simple, transformative change on the entire retail experience, what it means to shop, and particularly to shop online. So what Bezos says is, if I have risk data and anecdotal data, if the risk data, the numbers, disagree with the anecdotes, I go and get more anecdotes. I spend more time on the front line listening to those soft signals of what's actually happening, particularly at that customer interface. The way that humans make sense of risk is to tell each other stories, anecdotes. Machines can't yet gather that stuff. They're getting close. I've been to events where AI developers have shown me a kind of anecdote gathering prototype. Machines can't yet have a conversation around the coffee machine that's making sense of the risk-taking, of the corporate culture, of how we engage with this stuff. Because I've yet to meet a robot that is capable of, frankly, drinking a coffee and having an unstructured conversation. No, that could be with us soon, maybe never happen. I'm going to do one final provocation. Having said I'm going to stop, I will really stop here. I'm absolutely certain, as a cognitive risk analyst, okay, so somebody specializing in human sense making and the regulation of human risk taking around that, I will say with utter certainty that there is going to be an AI generated disaster, a catastrophe of some kind, within the next 2 calendar years. So by the end of calendar year, let's say 2025, come and see me and collect money off me if there has not been an AI-generated disaster which has profoundly upset something in possibly financial services, healthcare, education. Fill in the blanks here. I'll tell you why I'm so confident of that the history of regulation, the history of risk controls, of audit, of all of these things that we talk about at ACCA, is a history of catastrophe followed by regulatory catch-up. And I say, as one of the advisors to the government program we have in the UK on the future governance of AI, what worries me with that program is that most of the representation in the think tank is from the developers and not from those like me who are concerned about cognitive and social harms. I'm absolutely convinced that the industry is so far ahead of the control process that a catastrophe is at this point inevitable. Please make sure that you are not the organization that suffers it.
Yeah, on that note, I mean, Andrea, I know you have so many things from what you've talked about before that you can add on that. I won't even go to my question because I know there are quite a few facets that I'm curious to hear what you have to say. Thank you, Roger.
Wow. Well, that was a wave of really provocative and I think very accurate sort of descriptions of what's going on. You did, Rachel mentioned the book, The Coming Wave from Mustafa Suleyman, which is a really great book that I recommend. I could see nodding heads. Everyone else recommends it. Mustafa Suleyman is one of the co-founders of DeepMind. And he's written a book that I think is essential reading. It's kind of a dark book in many ways because he is one of the innovators, one of the creators of the whole generative AI world and exponential tech world. And he's coming from it from a technologist standpoint, which often is represented by, hope springs eternal, opportunity, growth, innovation, money, etc. But he's actually sounding the alarm, and he's talking about the governance of generative AI and exponential tech. He also talks about synthetic biotechnology, which is another area that we're not talking about here today, which could be one of the areas that implodes in the next 2 years in terms of an event.
That's another hockey stick, actually. Thank you, Andrea. I was trying to think, yes, biotech would be a great one. Yeah.
Yeah, biotech, quantum is coming down the pike as well, which will completely upend cybersecurity. So, and there are people who are working on not letting that happen. And the reason that quantum would upend cybersecurity is that we have encryption that protects us to a certain extent from cyber attacks. But quantum is going to be so powerful that it can just destroy encryption. And so now we have people who are creating quantum ready encryption, or this is like this arms race taking place really at the end of the day that the technologists are engaged in. And to Roger's point, the regulators are far behind. The technologists are way ahead. And just put in your mind for a moment, wherever you live, who you think is a dangerous nation state actor or a dangerous organization. It could be one of the big American technology companies. It could be someone else, right? It could be certainly criminal gangs and cyber gangs. When they get their hands on this stuff, and they already probably have, and they haven't quite shown their faces yet in a big way, to Roger's point, when those I don't want to call them all bad actors, but they are bad actors if they have negative and destructive impacts on society, on people, on humanity, on values, and so on. And so I'm afraid that I agree with Roger that there will be some major event at some point soon. And I give it, a little more, maybe between 2 and 4 years, that will have a really hard impact on us. And I'll just use another example. I saw a video that somebody had put together maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and now it's really potentially imminent. And it was basically a warning that through technological advances, we could have swarms of drones that basically are, instructed to find the right people. This video I saw was a fictional enactment of some female politician's son in college, and some terrorists knew his facial recognition, knew where he was, programmed the drones to find him, and found him in his classroom in the university. And the drones basically, killed the students in the classroom, including the student. This is not science fiction, unfortunately, and it's actually happening in the wars that we have ongoing today, in Ukraine and Russia, in the Middle East. And so this is not science fiction anymore. It's a science reality. And so I think for those of us who are not quite at the bleeding edge of some of this stuff, because we're accountants or lawyers or auditors, financial people in business, bringing it back down to our level of what do we need to do? How do we need to think about this stuff? I think one of the most critical things of all is that we have to be informed. We have to read what's going on, pick up the newspaper, go online, subscribe to a tech, resource. Obviously, ACCA and Good Governance Academy are both doing cutting edge work in this area. So subscribe to their work, read their materials, subscribe to one of the tech magazines online, whichever one you think makes sense for you, and learn what's going on from day to day, because if you're not current with at least what the newspapers are publishing or talking about, you are really going to fall behind both personally and professionally. And I, as someone who, I used to be a general counsel and a chief ethics and compliance officer, as well as a chief risk officer, and oversaw a bunch of different things in 4 different companies for about 18 years before I started my own business. As someone who is kind of a risk person at the end of the day, that's, I think we all end up doing kind of the things that we're good at or have the skills for. I'm a risk person and a governance person and an ethics person. And I really think that there's a huge need for our kind of brain to be focused on these kinds of developments, because as Roger mentioned, the governments and the regulators are lagging behind for a variety of reasons. It's not even their fault. We're all lagging behind except for the bleeding edge technologists. And so we need to put our collective, powers together and analysis together to understand what's going on in our own company. So again, bringing it down to the very nitty gritty level for a moment, what can you do as a manager, as a higher level executive, as a board member? It's inform yourself, educate yourself continuously, not once in a while. Don't take a course once in a blue moon. Actually engage in this continuously, one way or another, and then translate that into action in your environment. Translate that into inquiring what's going on in your company, in your team, asking your team leader, what are we doing about understanding generative AI, both as a tool and as something that has been incorporated in our day-to-day business. And so I'm a huge advocate, and always have been, even when I was head of enterprise risk management for a couple of companies, of having interdisciplinary teams talking to each other about risk and opportunity. As Rachel has said several times today, I view risk and opportunity as 2 sides of the coin. You know your risks, you actually have opportunity to create more value or to at least mitigate liability, regulatory action, et cetera. So, put an interdisciplinary team together if you don't already have one that includes people who understand the technology, whether it's an IT person or chief information security officer or one of your innovators. Have those people as part of that core group that's looking at the risk horizon. And so for me, I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, Rachel, and some of your questions, but I think it's worth sort of teeing up at this point, right? That to me, enterprise risk management, especially in medium to large companies, but even in smaller companies who can customize the way they look at risk, they have got to bring the whole generative AI and potentially other exponential techs into their purview, not only as, what's going to happen in 5 years? No, what's happening today and what's already happened to us, and what do we need to do to mitigate, or to certainly to identify and then to mitigate those risks, and have those right people around the table, and bring in the outside experts who understand this stuff as needed, right? And I say that both at the enterprise risk level, but also at the risk governance level. And Professor Mervyn talked about the board level sort of view of this. And I work a lot with boards and I serve on boards. And I think that's one of the most direly needy areas in terms of continuous education, infusion of creativity and thoughtfulness when it comes to understanding these new texts. As I mentioned earlier, I co-wrote a book on AI like 7 years ago, and AI was nothing compared to what it is today. So we've gone from this, AI is interesting to AI is exponential, the hockey stick, right? And that's happening with other technologies too. So the board level, and we can talk about, I'll save this for later if you like, Rachel, but there's the enterprise risk management level, which is at the company management and sort of operational level. And then there's the risk governance level on these tech issues. And there's a whole coterie of things that boards should be doing, thinking, and they're starting to. And someone, I think it was you, Rachel, alluded to the NACD work that they started with AI on boards. And there are a lot of resources that are now being produced. I'm on a couple of different groups as well that are producing some interesting work that we're going to publish next year. So there's a lot of activity, but it can't just be activity and lovely white papers. It needs to be action. And so at the board level, there has to be a self-assessment of what the skill set is. There has to be an understanding of what the competitive environment is. If you thought that a competitor could come out of the woodwork, whether directly in your sector or from a completely different sector, in the past to eat your lunch and destroy your business model, think about that as times 100 now. The Blockbuster video, the Kodak digital sort of examples, those were situations where they didn't foresee what was coming down in their competitive environment. That was within their own sector. Now we have people coming from completely different places eating lunches. I see Roger has his hand up, so go for it. You're on mute.
You're on
Yep.
mute. Everyone.
Classic rookie. Have we learned nothing from hybrid working?
You need an AI assistant to
talking about simple technology. So, I mean, Andrea, absolutely. And how prescient to have written about AI, before the current wave of, let's call it, human-friendly AI break. So my take on it is this, and my field of study is a little bit niche, to be frank. It's the risk perception that we apply to the design of regulation. So let me try and translate that into more plain language. Throughout human history, we have invented stuff, and I gave you a couple of examples a while back. In the current wave of ingenuity, invention, we have a group of technologists who, perhaps more than at any time in history, have this great self-belief in the transformative power of what they're doing. And it's a wonderful thing, this human optimism that leads people to explore, in the same way that the explorers in the Middle Ages got into boats and sailed off the edge of the known world to see if there was another continent to be discovered. It's an extraordinary thing, this human optimism, that makes people push out the boundaries. Unfortunately, in the social culture and the risk-taking culture of Silicon Valley, we have a new, and I'm going to call it slightly perverse, direction for that. Now, I don't know if you've read any of the testimonies that some of these developers have provided to US Congress or any of the think tanks that have been starting to look at this. We're very focused on this in the UK right now, and it does concern me that the developers themselves still seem to be a little too much in the driving seat. The history of regulation of any technology, or indeed any sort of humanity changing development, is always, I'm afraid, a predictable repeating pattern of the development proceeds, everyone sees the benefit, things go well for a while until there is a catastrophe. And then the regulation tries to make sense of what just happened. It tries cognitively to kind of reappraise the catastrophe. But then the regulation always addresses the last catastrophe. And this is how we had the banking crisis in 2008, because the regulation was all designed around capitalization crises, which is what had happened in banking in the 80s and 90s, not around the kind of liquidity shocks that we were getting with massively leveraged products in derivatives markets and mortgage insurance and all that stuff. We've all seen The Big Short and those movies that help to make sense of it. So the conception of the risk as created by the regulators failed to predict the thing that was happening next. And I see several of our commentators, thank you, those who pointed out that this is what again, many of you will know as the Donald Rumsfeld test. Do we know what we know? What about the unknown unknowns? So let's try and break down. Paul Rumsfeld got a lot of stick for saying this at the time, but he's actually right. And let me just introduce you to another bit of science jargon that you may not have heard before today, metacognition. So metacognition is the human skill of knowing what you don't know. It's knowing when to stop talking because you don't know what you're talking about. And it's a skill that certain professions, I'm very sorry to say, Andrea, present company, absolutely accepted, but quite a number of academics that I've worked with are sadly lacking in metacognition. They will carry on talking, even though it's quite clear they don't know what they're talking about, because this cult of expertise. Now, in one sense, and I have a research colleague at Yale who looks at this, how many people are locked in, literally incarcerated, actually, in the US justice system on the say-so of so-called expert witnesses who are actually exceeding their brief? You know, showboating medics and academics and even forensic specialists who are so keen to be making showy points on the witness stand that they don't take a step back and say, do you know what? I don't know. We cannot know this. I don't know this. It's beyond the limits of my skill. We need a conversation with other expert people who can fill in the knowledge gaps. Now, generative AI is very largely lacking in metacognition. I have managed to get ChatGPT-4 a few times to say, I don't know, but it's very rare. What it will normally do is supply what it thinks is the best fit answer to the question. But Andrea and I, as hopefully serious scientists, we know when ChatGPT is fibbing, or as they call it rather in a rather baroque way, they call it hallucinating. But let's be clear, hallucinating, it's kind of like greenwashing. It's just an elegant word that means lying. Greenwashing is lying. Hallucinating is lying. It's making stuff up.
Well, and
It's
you know,
filling in the gaps. It's inventing. You said, I think, Andrea, a moment ago, inventing citations is a classic thing. By the way, it's a thing that first-year students do all the time. They say, "Oh, I read that book and it said that," and you say, "Well, actually, I read that book and it doesn't say that. So, are you sure you've read that book? Do you maybe want to change that citation?" ChatGPT is still very much at that kind of showing off. You know, look at all this stuff I've read, but I don't really understand it. Stage.
you know, one of the you put your finger on one of the most important critical issues of our time, which is we now have these amazing tools flooding the zone, right? All of us have access to this, that, and the other thing, but we really don't know the quality control or the sources, the provenance of a lot of this. That's a lot of the problem. And at the same time, we're taking it and we're running with it, just like we did with social media, just like we did with internet. We're running with it, good, bad, and ugly, whatever the garbage in, garbage out situation might be, right? And so what this underscores for me more than ever is the need for that. I mentioned humans in the loop. It's not just humans in the loop, critical thinking humans in the loop, people who are being who are continuing to educate themselves. A few years ago, I came across, this is about 10 years ago now, someone who's in the tech industry who wrote a book called The Techie and the Fuzzy. And it was the first time I had heard this idea that you need to have both kinds of people working together. The techie, of course, is engineer, mathematician, etc. The fuzzy is the liberal arts person, the person who's studied sociology, political science, anthropology, other things that allow you to develop critical thinking skills and analytical skills. And I think that is one of the most important things that we need to continue to really focus on as humans in the midst of this avalanche of technology.
Totally. I come to this as a fuzzy myself, I have to say. So
yeah, I'm a fuzzy myself.
My first degree was English literature. My second one was linguistics. And only then did I go into political science, and only then into the psychology of risk design. It was kind of a meaningful sequence, although it didn't quite feel like it at the time. So making sense of how people make sense of stuff and how we as humans understand the human condition. There's some fascinating stories from the early days of what we now think of as sort of mainstream technologies. So one of my favorite ones is when the first express railway was being built in the UK in the 1840s. I think all train nerds, pause here because you know all this. The Great Western Railway was the first express railway. It was designed as part of a fast transport link from London to New York with a fast steamship. Anyway, the two engineers designing it, Brunel and Gooch, used to take the locomotives and race them up and down the tracks on a Friday night. And they probably had a few beers as well, because they had this wonderful new high-speed technology that the world had never seen before. And they were basically kids. They were both in their 20s, early 30s, and they were just having fun with the tech. And it was only when they ran over a workman and killed it that they thought maybe we should start to think about, signals and brakes and guardrails, as we now call them. and other forms. I mean, also on a railway anecdote, the world's first public railway, the day it opened, it ran over and killed the VIP who was opening the railway itself. So you can't get a better metaphor for, unbridled tech, unchecked technology than that. And as I say, look, in every field of technology, history repeats and repeats and repeats itself. We are at that, if you like, railway opening moment with a generative AI right now. Somebody is going to get seriously hurt. The techs themselves use this phrase that really alarms me. They talk about seeking forgiveness, not permission. Now, if you're an auditor, if you're a governance person, can you imagine somebody going to Mervyn King at the Bank of England to say, "Oh, by the way, I've just bet the bank on something, but I'm now seeking your forgiveness, not permission."
Well, and
this is not how markets are supposed to work.
Right. A variation on that theme is Mark Zuckerberg's value system when he founded Facebook, which is move fast and break things. And boy, has he broken a lot of things, right?
He's broken a lot of things. He's broken a lot of things. Well, let's talk about teenage and mental health for a start, all that.
And let's also, guys, before we go in, because that's all your points about how do we make sure that what happened with social media doesn't happen with AI and all the things we talked about, everything being owned by Silicon Valley and how we make sure that doesn't happen with this transformation too. Let's just see what all the other fuzzies out there, what they're concerned about, what their concerns about AI are. So Carolyn put one up while you were talking, and you can see for yourself, and maybe
I may have had some involvement in writing these questions.
Yes.
Well, the one
I'm glad people share those concerns.
The one that is most answered reflects maybe the composition of our audience, which is, I would think, tends towards the financial auditing.
Controls,
controls, which is we
Absolutely.
aren't sufficient internal controls. But there
so
are.
Like I say, my very simple study of the history of risk controls over the last 250 years just shows that there is this absolutely repeating pattern. At first, we get the technology, we get the wave of optimism, we get things being achieved differently. Then as night follows day, we get the catastrophe, we get the framing of regulation. The regulation then fails to address the next crisis, and so the cycle continues. And with AI, we aren't even into the first major crisis yet. And that's why I'm afraid I'm so convinced that we are going to hit a crisis point in the very near future. I'm going to predict less than 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the other answers here also point to sort of the human skills that we all have, supposedly, at least prior to this development of AI. And I'm just looking at it here again. Privacy concerns clearly are a huge issue for the last 30 years or so, yes. But now they're turbocharged. And then we have erosion of management skills and personal interactions.
Yeah.
And I think
I'm going to say those two, actually the two about management skills and public trust, I think those two are absolutely kind of cousins to each other. This idea, I'm a big fan, as other fellow panelists know, of this idea of management by wandering about. It's one of the core indicators that I use when I'm doing a culture assessment of any organization. How much face time, human interaction do the senior people get with the frontline people, and indeed do frontline people from different parts of the organization, different silos, get with each other?
Well, and
it's so predictive of the strength of culture when you have that working well.
When you have the sort of the floodgates of new tech, exponential tech entering the world and the workforce and everything else, together with the impact of COVID, you have, this real sort of, I think McKinsey and others have said, we have catapulted ourselves forward 5 or 10 years from normal evolution to that, to that place. And so our psyches, and I'm not a psychologist, so I beg to forgiveness if I say anything wrong, but our psyches are unable to adapt as quickly as the circumstances that are hitting us, both from a tech standpoint, but also now the pandemic aftermath. And who knows? I mean, I hate to say this, but if we were talking about synthetic bio, we would be talking about an event happening soon as well. And so, it's not just the generative AI, but if you put synthetic bio and generative AI together, all bets are off. And so there are those kinds of things. But one thing I want to say to your points, Roger, is that in terms of the positive spin on all of this is, yeah, management skills, yeah, privacy, yeah, controls. But this really argues in favor of us becoming more assertive as humans, to put ourselves in the loop of these things that are happening, and to basically make the case that we have to be educated and skilled up, or reskilled, to deal with these new tools, which are really powerful and will allow us to do things. I come from the legal environment. I was in a couple of big Wall Street firms early in my career, and I did all the scut work you can imagine a young lawyer does. Well, all of that stuff now, generative AI will probably replace that kind of work at the very early stages of a career. That doesn't mean that you're not valuable. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't become a lawyer or an accountant or something else. What it means is you're going to have tools at your disposal, just like when the calculator was invented. Suddenly, you don't have to do math in your head. You have a calculator. Well, the same thing here. Suddenly, you don't have to collect a million different data points to try to figure out. It's the generative AI is going to look at the data, see the patterns, do systematic kind of analysis, and help you find and or do things that you could never do before, just like doctors as well.
Okay. What about false correlations and false positives? So there's a wonderful website. I forget the name of the website. One of us here will remember it before we finish, I'm sure, about false correlations. And so some guy, I'm thinking at Harvard about a decade ago, came up with a sort of prototype AI that took data sets from all kinds of different domains and matched where you had a curve which moved at the same rate. And he created a wonderful book about false correlations, which proved, among other things, that whenever Nick Cage releases a movie, more people go and drown themselves, because statistically the two curves are a perfect fit. Or, the classic thing about cholera and ice cream consumption, that the more people eat ice cream, the more people die from cholera. Well, of course, in fact, that's explicable by a third factor, which is that it's the summer and that the cholera virus thrives at the same time as people are eating ice cream, and that the two factors are unrelated but correlate to a third externality. The worry with AI is that it's going to start spotting correlations where none exist.
Sure.
And not asking those, as I said earlier, those sort of synthesis questions of what explains, the fact that you can fit two pieces of data together does not mean that there's a causal link. It could well be that there's some externality that we haven't spotted yet.
And it's going to become ever more difficult, because the quantity and potentially the quality of what the AI has looked at is very hard to control. And that's why a lot of people are talking about regulating and vetting the data that they're using and the provenance of the data. I mean, there's no better place to think about this as the news media industry, because they've been frontally attacked on deep fakes and
Right.
all kinds of other things. And so and we have been frontally attacked as consumers of news by this, that, and the other thing out there, the good, the bad, and the ugly and the uglier. I mean, the people who are putting out disinformation, who are social engineering their way into companies and organizations through disinformation. This is going to be turbocharged by the generative AI capability of new visuals that look like real people, or audio. There was an audio I heard of Hillary Clinton the other day, where she was supporting the re-election of Donald Trump. I kind of doubt that, right? I mean,
right. But it's the same. It's the same as the Pope.
It sounded just like her.
It's the same as the Pope in a puffer jacket. It's an image that you can't get out of your head once you've seen it, and that, as a behavioral scientist, that is what depresses me, that humans are, for all those wonderful reasons I talked about an hour or so ago, that as animals, we're actually very well adapted to survive in hostile environments, to make snap decisions based on too little information. And unfortunately, in modern society, those snap decision circuits in the brain lead us astray, or more importantly, they are capable of being led astray by people who understand how that circuitry works. Now, the only example I've so far managed to find, and I absolutely would love to hear from ACCA and Good Governance Academy members on this, The only example I found of a collective pushback against this is the nation of Sweden. Now, if you know anything about European geography, you're vaguely aware, I'm sure, that Sweden has just beyond its northern border a certain country which is not noted for its democratic uprightness and indeed sponsors troll farms. So the Swedish government's view of this is that the best thing to do is equip Swedish high schoolers with cognitive skills, with rationality tools, with constructive challenge, and actually teach them to critically assess every piece of information. And again, this goes to my work with the Foreign Office in the UK, the idea that why is this, and again, this will echo, I'm sure, with those of you who work as auditors, why is this information coming in on this channel? Why is this person saying this thing to me in this form at this time? Why is it that the information presents itself to me? What we've raised, unfortunately, in the generation of social media, let's call them digital natives, the kids for whom social media is just part of their daily life, is sadly a generation of people who have had cynically switched off by the system creators, have had that cognitive function, that challenge function, that critical faculty disabled. Because what the producers have done, if you read, again, Rachel's mentioned the book about this, the coming wave. There's plenty of other stuff. There's some great videos which you can flag up in the resources after this. The people who designed social media platforms are absolutely, they are, PhD level cognitive scientists, a lot of them. They understand cynically how to switch these brain circuits on and off. And one of the brain circuits is, hang on a minute, that's, why would I believe that? What they do is get you very efficiently and very quickly into a state of heightened affect. So you're anxious, you're angry, you're keen to engage, you're sort of maybe in love with an idea or something or a person. All of those mental states disable your frontal lobes, your rational cognitive assessment. And social media works like that by switching on your amygdala, your fight or flight, your affect circuits, and switching off your critical appraisal circuits. And actually, for as long as you're in that heightened affect state, you're going to buy more stuff. You're going to be more receptive to the advertising. That's why they do it. Now, this may sound like a rant, but this is based on very solid science, which rather sadly, if you look at the industry itself, go to their conferences, talk to their developers, they admit it. This is the game that is being played. What we have is AI, as Andrea says, coming in off the back of that. So we've had a decade of social media defeating these higher cognitive functions. And now into that, as it were, wide open space where we're all sort of, oh, wow, affective state, receptive to anything, this tidal wave of unsorted information. And when we talk about machine learning, let's just be clear what we mean. It's not that the machine is learning to discriminate the data that's being put in. It is simply, as in my example of financial voice trading markets, it is just hoovering up the entirety of the information. Andrea mentioned, that one of the big learning, help me with the language here, the learning set, the raw material.
Yeah.
One of the biggest learning sets for generative AI is the internet itself, the World Wide Web and everything that is published on it.
Yeah.
Now, stop me if I'm going wildly off track here, but last time I looked, the World Wide Web is full of absolute, I'm not going to use the word, nonsense. Anyone can publish anything.
One I will have to just throw in there, and I told you guys last week on a call, is I have a secret crush on Nick Thompson. So he's the former editor of Wired magazine and now the CEO of The Atlantic, and he does his everyday little 5-minute video. What is the most interesting thing in tech today? And it's just addictive, and it's really, really useful for our
There's
audience.
a really good article in The Atlantic on generative AI and social harms actually this week, which is worth a look. Yeah.
Like I said, there's so much out there. And also, by the way, we're getting so many really great, you're sparking lots of great comments, both of you. And
I'm just trying to provoke a discussion here.
You're the agent provocateur of our webinar.
And also lots of great questions for our Q&A section. But
Good.
before that, let's put in our last polling question and see what you think of those answers. I think there is a good conversation. I mean, you have said quite a lot about this. What
I
can
think
they
I've touched on at least 3 of those 4 points. Yeah.
Give it a couple more seconds. So what do they look like, Carolyn? That
Oh, I'm going to leave a little bit. People are still madly capturing their answers. So if you give it another.
Can we say they can choose? Are we right saying we can tick any which they think apply? So it's not a choice of either or, just to be clear.
Multiple choice, yes.
Multiple,
they
yeah,
can
any which apply.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought one thing that we did on our forum that was really you touched on it a bit, both, is just the fake citations.
Yeah. There was a case in the United States not so long ago where a lawyer who was representing a plaintiff or a defendant in a case in New York City did a quick ChatGPT collection of cases to cite in his legal brief. And when he showed up with his legal brief and people read it, it was all garbage. It was all made up. It was legal hallucinations, if you want to call it that. And it was terribly embarrassing for the lawyer, but I have to say, he was cheating. He was not paying attention, or maybe he was expecting ChatGPT to be God Almighty. And ChatGPT is humans at our worst as well as our best, perhaps. But that's why the humans in the loop thing is a critically important concept that we have to continue and also some of the cognitive material that Roger has been sharing with us is critically important and needs to be part of the equation throughout. Interesting. Related.
So the last one, again, we hadn't actually talked about it yet, but I'm very pleased that people pick up spontaneously on that. This is what you may have heard described as nudging. So nudging is the potentially benign science of framing a decision in such a way, people didn't save enough to invest in their pensions. So the British government changed the nudge to encourage people and actually force people to set money aside for their retirement. So that was arguably a benign nudge. But of course, in things like, take an example everyone knows about, gym membership, it's much easier to join a gym than to resign your gym membership. So your consent is assumed, and then your decision framing is kind of nudged in a direction which you might not necessarily want it to go, which is they're going to carry on taking money off you until you go through this rather complicated sort of sign-off procedure. And AI, again, amplifies that sort of manipulative element of commerce.
I don't want us to gloss over a couple of really important dangers and risks that we haven't mentioned yet, which I think are really important to keep in mind. And that is, we've had it already through, algorithms that are, built in ways that are imperfect, to say the least. But now it's getting much worse with the power of generative AI. And that is the potential for discrimination, for bias, for, discriminating against groups of people, whether it's gender, race,
postcodes.
Yeah, to me, that one is a huge issue that we haven't touched on, that is going to get only worse if we don't put in some of the guardrails and regulatory pieces. And I think there's another one. Again, we could talk about everything all the time, right? Everything, everywhere, all the time. But the other one is this becomes a part of geopolitical relations. And we had a glimmer, a sliver of good news last night with the Biden meeting, where they did say they were going to collaborate on AI, on looking at guardrails, and each country is going to have its own regs and approach. And different countries are doing different things. Spain has now an agency for this, and you have the many meetings that we've seen recently that are both government meetings and public-private meetings, and then they're the voluntary type of things that are taking place. but I think the nation state actors plus the tech actors, which are not nation state actors, they're sort of frontierless.
Supranational, I think is the word. Yeah.
Yeah, and we're going more and more, and actually Mustafa Suleiman talks about this in the Coming Wave book. There's no nation state barriers here, but there are nation state actors and there are geopolitical consequences. So very, very big picture, and then really more personal picture, the discrimination. I wanted to mention those two are going to be deeply affected by this new exponential technology and what it can do.
I mean, it's worth maybe here mentioning, because I'm sure we'll have a lot of financial markets people in this audience, given that there's an accountancy profession background to many. One thing that I have observed for what it's worth in financial markets over the last decade, and this is very much my research area, so forgive me for going niche again, is that the regulators are extremely willing to adopt the best findings of behavioral science and collectively to move in a similar direction. So there are, again, this is extremely niche knowledge, and don't worry about the initials, but there's an organization called IOSCO, which gathers together all of the financial regulators around the world, where they share, among other things, behavioral research and effective levers for prosecution of misconduct. What they have discovered is that if you seek not so much mistrading, not what we used to call financial misconduct, but this new idea of non-financial misconduct, which is a horrible, clumsy phrase, but one of my American clients said, "Oh, you mean just being obnoxious?" And yeah, that's it. Basically, being casually obnoxious. I mean, they used another phrase which I won't use in an open podcast, but so where you have patterns of behavior where people are casually mistreating each other, those are very effective early indicators, early predictors, even for more serious misconduct consequences. So for mistrading, for at corporate scale, taking advantage of consumer ignorance, if we want to put it simply like that. And I think what we're seeing with AI is very analogous to what happened in financial markets 15 years ago. The proponents of it are running so far ahead of the consumer capacity to make sense of what's going on that somebody is going to seriously abuse somebody, or indeed, abuse a market or the naivety of a market.
Yeah.
So our best protection against this is to get rather, I mean, I'm so, Biden and Xi having a meeting, astonishing development, actually, particularly in the AI space. What we need is this supranational sense of this is genuinely, I don't want to go, completely off the crazy edge here, but there is certainly, if not an existential threat to humanity, at least a reappraisal of what it means to be human versus technology assisted.
Yep.
And I think we do need to forcibly assert what it means to be human, to work together as humans, to cooperate as a human race. And it is encouraging at last to see big ticket politicians supranationally getting together on this, because left to their own devices, I'm not saying the developers are bad people, but let's just hover a little bit over that phrase, forgiveness, not permission. I'm not sure I want my kids asking me for forgiveness, not permission. I don't know about you. I'd rather we had some guardrails to begin with.
So I have no
I'd rather we had some guardrails first. Yeah. Well, my dog, I don't want my dog coming in and fouling the carpet in the living room. I need to train it to behave in a pro-social way, not to assume that antisocial behavior is normal.
There's quite a few questions just around your thoughts on, should we be looking at international treaties, something that cybersecurity missed out on. And then, of course, you pointed out social media as well. We had the summit here in the UK, but in my conversations with our members, and as I said earlier, I think that realistically, in the near term, what we need is these industries to come together the way the IOSCO, for financial services and healthcare with FDA, and there needs to be some kind of industry sort of standards, even before we are fortunate enough to really see some kind of international cooperation to protect humans in that respect.
But as Reggie, we've discussed this on the ACCA channel before, as so often with regulation, but the people who've invented the new stuff, they have that sort of shock advantage of surprising people, saying, look, we can do this. And because the technology can do this, everyone sort of buys one of my journalist friends calls this hopium, which I think is brilliant. We're selling people this sort of drug of optimism around the new technology. and we're inevitably going to, as with abuse of a drug, we're going to be let down at some point when we realize that this is not entirely real or it doesn't come without consequences. The problem is regulation as an enterprise, as a human enterprise, of lawmaking generally. I'm going to put Andrea back on the spot as a lawyer for a second. I think, can we agree that the law and regulation consistently throughout human history has underestimated forces of nature and human nature and technology? It's overestimated our capacity to get ahead of problems and frame them and head things off before they go wrong. And we also consistently mispredict how people will respond to the advent of new technologies.
I totally agree with you. And that's personally for me, part of the reason I don't practice law, because you're sort of in that fourth square of what is today, even though you're trying to anticipate as well. And a lot of lawyers do great work, and regulators and so on. But by definition, they're going to be behind the times. And
it's never predictive, right? I mean, can we think of any kind of predictive legislation ever? I struggle.
I don't think it's possible politically. I think the other thing that I wanted to add to the sort of the geopolitical and political discussion is the danger to democracy of these technologies. The surveillance economy, surveillance capitalism, coined by great, I have her book over there, Shoshana, is surveillance capitalism, but it's gotten way beyond that. I just read something pertaining to the Middle Eastern situation right now, where NSO, which is a company that Israeli company that does surveillance, that got into a lot of trouble a few years ago. Well, they're now they're able to track some of the cell phones of the hostages taken into Gaza. And again, you can say, okay, they're doing something potentially to help save these people. But on the other hand,
this was the company that did the backdoor entry to people's telephones. Yes,
exactly.
I remember that case.
So all of us, and now with generative AI capabilities, it goes way beyond anything we had before. And so we are going to be in a complete surveillance economy or society. And democracy is going to be under attack. And we've already been under attack for other things in democracies, for good reasons sometimes. But the point is, this whole exponential tech development is going to affect our human rights, our privacy rights, all of these things that we hold dear, supposedly, in our democracies that are sort of under attack. I saw Rachel is kind of unhappy because she wants us to answer questions.
Well, Andrea, I was going to say, maybe we can come back to this. What's the tool that we need? What's the humanity, what's the equipment that humanity needs to fight back? I think I know, but I'll be really interested to maybe talk about that at the next stage.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of really great questions that you field the audience to come out and ask. So there was just one, but they keep coming in fast. I can't even.
I know. I see
all the great comments.
I can't read them.
Let me just go back to just the actual Q&A, maybe. But even in the chat, there's so many great ones. Is AI an objective program, or is it subject to the bias of the people who programmed it? I think you've addressed that already.
Yes.
So I'd like to address the cybersecurity analogy because I do some work in that space as well. And by nature of the beast, so to speak, cybersecurity is more about defending against attacks. Generative AI is about everything. It's not just, it's not defensive, it's not aggressive, it's everything. It's in products and services, in our day-to-day work, in our cell phones, et cetera, et cetera. So cybersecurity provides a model of sorts, I think, and people are building on it. For example, in the United States, the National Industry Standards, NIST, NIST, everybody knows NIST, has done a lot of work on cybersecurity and creating risk frameworks for that. They've now published one for AI as well. So there are ways of doing it nationally, and then ways of linking up certainly with allies, but we should be also linking up with competitors, or don't want to call them enemies necessarily, but because this is frontierless stuff, and it's potentially very dangerous. And so I think, again, the Biden-Xi agreement to look at AI together internationally, what happened in the UK a couple of weeks ago, these are all really important developments. Cybersecurity hasn't done enough of that. Maybe we can do a little more of that here. I think the bottom line with generative AI and with cybersecurity in terms of their dangers is that we will always default to the weakest link in the chain, which would be the rogue actor, the asymmetric power that someone has. You know, the guy in his mother's basement who has generative AI capabilities that can create a horrible cyber attack. You know, those kinds of things are never going to be caught. Or maybe they'll get caught, but they can't be eliminated. And that's the kind of thing we have to be struggling with here.
I'm more cynical, but I come at this from a slightly different angle, which is the cognitive side. Here's the thing. We talked about the cognitive skill, the processing power of generative AI back in the first stage of this. And you need to see, I mean, various people published on this. I don't want to get into the specialist language, but there's an idea that there are three kind of marker posts along the road here. So the first marker post is at which semi-intelligent machines can do the jobs that are, that we find boring and do them better. Well, clearly we're already there. The second stage, which we're rapidly approaching in the next year or so, is where, again, a semi-intelligent machine can hold a fluent conversation with rational argument and good analytical conclusions. We're not quite at the analytical conclusions, but we're getting very close to the good argument. The third stage, which is the one everyone worries about, is the existential crisis, is when the machines are self-informing and can overtake us. Now, there are some slightly alarming training dialogues where people have had a conversation with a generative AI saying, well, if you wanted to save the planet, what would be your proposal as the governor of a national or supranational organization? And the AI said, well, first of all, I would eliminate the human race because they're the main producers of all of this anthropogenic pollution that's causing global climate change. So once the human race is out of the way, then the world can recover. No, you can't fault the rational argument, maybe, but you might have a question around the political acceptability or indeed the humanity of the course of action that it proposes. So just coming back to cybersecurity for a minute, what the machines are rapidly learning with things like deepfake technology is how shockingly easy it is to defeat human rationality, to fool people, rather like a good stage magician, to misdirect people into not seeing the trick. Now, I'm going to go back to Sweden again for a second here because I really admire what they're doing. So the Rosling Institute in Sweden has had great success in transforming the national education program such that every 16 and 17-year-old in Sweden learns critical thinking skills, learns to question, or that phrase I was given by an analyst friend, to forage for the truth, to go out and look for the provenance of this factoid that is being presented to me by whatever online source it is. So not to uncritically consume online information or other people's opinions, and also not to be constantly seeking social approval for my own thinking. You should be in a state of mild skepticism. It's good, a little bit of uncertainty, a little bit of mild skepticism is actually good for you. Not to be living in this sort of social media-induced state of constant approval seeking. This is the thing we have to maneuver a generation of largely sort of young people out of, back into a rather more, let's say, early Enlightenment period, 1700s, where thinking of why is this as it is. Isaac Newton himself, the great scientist, said, I'm like a child on the beach that's found a few pretty seashells. I may be a great scientist, but I sure as hell don't know everything. And that, the truth is like the ocean out there or the rest of the beach. It's just I've got a bag of a few things that I've found. And I think as a human race, and particularly as a generational thing, we've got to get people back into thinking, I'm not sure that I really know that. I may have heard that from someone. I may have mistaken somebody's strongly held opinion for fact. That's the other thing. And machines are very poor at distinguishing between strongly held opinion and objectively proven fact. And so we, the humans in all of this, and Andrea, I totally support your point here about getting more people back into the discussion, How
Yeah.
does cybersecurity work? Just really, let's be clear and focus on this. Cybersecurity is not about the technology.
It's
The hackers long ago discovered a
Yep.
thing called social engineering,
Yep.
which is, the simplest analogy I can think of, and let me leave you with this mental picture. So you invest, $1,000 in an incredibly strong metal front door with 3 locks in it. What the hacker knows is all they have to do is talk you into leaving the key in the locks. And that is how hacking works.
Yeah.
Far too many organizations are, investing more and more money in a stronger front door, but not then training people not to make these elementary cognitive errors of assuming that somebody who sounds like the finance director or the chief exec is actually the finance director. Because hang on a minute, it's the last Friday in the month. The chief exec is just off on a golfing holiday and he's saying, could you just mail me $500,000 to such and such an account? Wait a minute. That is not a good sounding transaction. Let us not please this fictitious chief exec by sending the money. Let's say, why is this message reaching me through this channel at this time? And when it sounds like the chief exec, sorry, chief exec, do you mind? I'm just going to put the phone down and call you back in 5 minutes. And you call back the chief exec, and sure enough, it was not the chief exec. They have no idea who made that call. It was a voice AI synthesizer.
Exactly.
That's how it works. It's not the machine. Please, 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 people. It is not the technology. It's the human social engineering element that is the biggest risk by far, and is also, by the way, the biggest thing that generative AI is good at faking.
Right.
And we so need to get ourselves up to speed on getting ahead of that.
And absolutely, as a mother on WhatsApp groups, when you get already they're looking at how they hack schools to contact the parents. It's terrifying. Or they send you a WhatsApp.
Rachel, I had one. So my eldest daughter, 20-something, perfectly capable, apparently phoned me from the train. She's had her wallet stolen. Could I send her some money? And she's borrowing somebody else's phone. First thing I did was say, give me that person's phone number and I'll call them back. But then I called her mobile phone, and sure enough, it wasn't her, because it wasn't this person on the phone.
I want to add a couple of thoughts to the cybersecurity piece. Years ago, I've done quite a bit of work in cybersecurity and organizational resilience, and I came across a video on YouTube. I don't remember the name, but if you Google it, anyone can find it. It's basically a white hacker team that breaks down into a power substation. They don't say where it is, but it looks like it's the northeast of the United States. And it's basically a bunch of ex-intelligence military kind of guys who are white hackers, but they use social engineering to get in, and they are able to do anything and everything inside that substation. It's a great 25-minute video to just understand that the humans behind this. It's not the technology per se. They do use a lot of different technologies to, cover up videos and stuff like that.
Right. So
that's number one. Number two, another tidbit that I think is really important to your point about training and education and the cognitive piece. Estonia was one of the first countries to start educating their kindergartners on cybersecurity. Now, we should do the same thing, but on exponential technologies, starting at home.
Primary school.
Primary school. Just talking, developing curricula, understanding ways of, reaching a 5-year-old and an 8-year-old and a 12-year-old, et cetera, because they are the digital natives and they are swimming in this. And there's a lot of dangers that we need to, as humans that are maybe a little older, hopefully have some wisdom to provide on this. But we really need to start the education at the early stage, just like the cognitive piece.
Should we talk about stranger danger for a minute? Because this actually goes back to an earlier frame. And when my kids were little, I taught them, do talk to strangers, which I know is counterintuitive, but actually, and what I don't mean by that just randomly, mill around the streets and solicit, unknown adults. But when you're in the checkout queue at the supermarket or at the bus stop, it's a perfectly normal human being thing to do to strike up a conversation with the person next to you. Even us Brits who are quite, socially shy, it's actually quite okay to have a conversation with another adult who's in the same, children particularly are very happy to have conversations. They're disinhibited. That's a rather wonderful thing about childhood. But instead of teaching children to be afraid of everything that's out there, think about this. If you teach your child to have a normal conversation with an adult, they will then have a frame of reference to understand what a normal conversation is. Instead of having a worldview that says every adult interaction is potentially, stranger danger risky, instead of that fearful mindset, you create a knowledge base that says, well, that was a normal conversation. That person wasn't trying to, lead me astray with a promise of come and meet my puppy at the house or whatever it is. All of that sort of stranger danger stuff that we teach shouldn't be necessary, in the sense that if you know what a proper conversation feels like. It seems to me we need to replicate this in cyberspace and with generative AI. And if we know that it's a normal conversation, and particularly that somebody's not trying to solicit something from us, because the giveaway is the classic thing of, oh, I've got some money, or can you help me with it? A clever social engineer will of course not make that demand with the first call. They'll build up trust and then they'll do it on the third or fourth. But we've got to be so, we shouldn't be persisting in a state of anxiety or suspicion of everyone. What we should do is establish a more robust baseline of what a trusting conversation feels like. And I can't overemphasize, you've got to start that at child level. Andrea, I totally agree. Teaching those sort of essential cognitive and critical skills at primary level is the foundation. And Estonia, rather like I said, with Sweden and Finland, it's really no coincidence that the Scandinavian and Baltic countries are investing a lot of effort in transforming their education system, because guess what their neighbors are up to with troll farms
and I think that's
very social engineering.
Andrea, sorry, did you want to add something?
No, I wanted to say that Karen's been waiting patiently.
No, this conversation is fabulous, and we've gone on for a long time. I just need to pull in some of the audience questions now. So there is one around the economics of AI. So when AI starts to go behind a paywall and it starts to become only those that can afford to access these tools, or only afford to access the tools that have got these guardrails and gates in place, that we start getting this disparate process happening again with the haves and the have-nots. Andrea, I know you've written something along those lines of the divisions that AI causes. Do you want to comment on that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think it always goes back to human beings having qualities and having non-qualities. And I think we bring who we are to the table, whether it's new technology or no technology. And so this is why I keep going back to the idea we have to have the right people around the table. Now, when you have the profit motive injected into this, which, the technology firms are building these tech tools, not for fun, not for humanity, but for profit. And they do recognize that there are dangers, but they also want to continue doing the move fast and break things, or maybe not break them totally. But one of the big consequences of move fast and break things is that we will continue to exacerbate inequality when we make it accessible only to people who can afford a $20 a month. I'm on a wait list for GPT-4. GPT 3.5 is available and anybody can use it, but it's nothing close to as good as what GPT-4 is, which is OpenAI's latest version, and it has much more bells and whistles and what have you. And so if you can't pay $20 a month for that, you're out of having access to that particular tool. And the same goes for all these other tools that are being developed. Many of them are free. Llama by Meta is open access, and yet and people appear to like it and use it. But one day there'll be a pay version, just like Facebook is now, thinking. I'm not on Facebook, but they're basically, I think, looking for a less ads, paid for version. And of course, we see that with X and Twitter, Twitter, yes. Twitter X. The check marks. And so again, you have to choose what makes sense for you. And I've been a Twitter user for 12 years and I don't like X, and I'm probably going to leave because I find it to be toxic right now. But the point is you have to spend time thinking about it and understanding it, and then deciding whether or not it's for you, and then whether you can pay for it or not. And so it will continue to marginalize certain people from its use. And the inequality factor will continue to be exacerbated by some of these technologies. There's no doubt about that.
Thanks, Andrea. And the
Can I
question
say
for you,
I've
Roger.
never been a Twitter fan.
I mean,
Or even
question for you,
Facebook.
Roger, is around. Sorry,
Yeah,
is
well,
around the
actually,
governance.
Andrea,
Oh.
you're making me feel quite guilty because I do have a ChatGPT-4 license. I got one of the earliest ones as a researcher, and hey,
There you go.
what is scary about it is how much more fluent it is. You can actually, as I say, you can interview yourself with it, and it's extremely plausible at asking thoughtful, structured questions, but still not quite. Anyway, to answer
Yes.
your question, Caroline.
Yeah. Sorry,
Caroline
I've
has a
got
different
another question. I've got a different
another
question
question.
for you.
Okay.
Yes, I've got a different question for you. In terms of the governance of AI and the role of the board in governing the organization's use of AI, are the traditional governance tools still appropriate, or governance policies, etc., or do we need some new flavor of governing tools?
Yes, to this final part of that question. Andrea, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'm chafing at the bit on this one because it's what I do. I've been a big critic of how boards select their people, keep their people on board and off board people. We are now at a time where it's not possible to have the old way of doing things at the board level. The board sets the tone from the top for the entire organization, is responsible for the CEO and the management team succession and selection, and is supposedly the cultural arbiter or conscience of the organization. So if you don't have the right people with the right skill set and future vision and technology know-how and critical skills that go beyond the financial, which, most board members have great financial skills and, operational skills, but they're not necessarily futurists or technologists or ESG experts. And these are the things that are going to dominate our world for as long as we're alive. And so we need a real reset at the board level to have a constant self-assessment of the skill set that's there, matched with both the strategy and the business opportunities as well as the risks. And so there has to be a much more proactive skilling of the board, not only in education, but also getting the right people and turning them over, not every 10 years, but maybe every 2 or 3.
And can I ask a follow-up question to that? Sorry,
Sure.
Rachel, you wanted to add,
No,
but let me...
I would just add to that in the G20 principles of corporate governance that just came out in September. Of course, those are meant more for policymakers, and we do see so many revisions on country codes of corporate governance. And a part of obviously the one new chapter is on resilience and sustainability. However, through all the 7 chapters, you will see a more focus on boards and who they are. So, nowadays and with social media and, all the information's out there. If you really investors did their homework, you can find that a lot of boards of the big companies, they all went to university together even. So, can
I quickly jump in on that? So yeah, we were looking in the financial markets. Again, we talk a lot about clearly financial regulation in our work in London. The financial regulations that came in getting on 10 years ago, the senior managers regime in London and its analogues in places like Australia, they talk about individual accountability and tone at the top a lot. But actually, a group of us went to the regulators and said, do you know what? Look at the mechanism of culture in an organization. Tone at the top is not necessarily what sets the whole culture. It's if you change tone at the top, it's what we can call a necessary but not sufficient condition. So you can create the right noises from the top. But what a really intelligent board will do is that thing of walk the floor, listen to the signals at the front line, acknowledge that the middle management layer often kind of filters information, reconstructs it around its own performance indicators, and that actually frontline staff don't necessarily do anything of what the board was saying. Also, a lot of, quite understandably, cynicism in the front line that what the board says is just rhetoric and it's all for the public audience or the politicians.
And
my indicator is always
integrated
connection.
Governance on that, Roger.
Right, it's managed. Good governance is by management by wandering about. It's connecting with the people on the front line, not just kind of handing stuff down and hoping for the best. That doesn't work.
And to that point, the diversity of the board is extraordinary.
Cognitive diversity is the big thing.
Cognitive diversity and background and experience diversity.
And intergenerational diversity.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Ageism.
So often you get board appointments where people maybe look different. You've got gender, ethnicity, maybe some social diversity, but if you scratch the surface, you find they all went to the same university and often read the same. I'm not going to go on about the British government, but actually they all went to Oxford and read PPE together. Why do we not have greater diversity of thinking in shaping governance? It's because the people governing the governance all had an extremely narrow frame of reference.
I've got another question. Thanks, Roger. I've got another question, actually, Rachel, for you. Some more insights in terms of, so you've done a global study on interviewing chief risk officers around the world. What is their general feedback in terms of AI and specifically in terms of the opportunities available for their organizations? Did they have a positive experience in terms of leveraging the opportunities available? So we heard about the risk side. What about the opportunities?
I think CROs are going through, I mean, we all are, a new phase in their careers about, okay, well, we know how to look at what our risk priorities are being, how we report it to the major decision makers. But they're also dealing with things like geopolitical risk. So it's not just about AI and, what is it going to do to our business model? How can we roll things out better for our customers, or how can we stay ahead, have a competitive edge with AI, or how can we detect risk better, which is one thing that the CROs have definitely, as Roger's pointed out, doing a lot of interesting things with, particularly we're detecting behavioral patterns and so on at the moment. But I think that what they are doing when it comes to the bigger picture about AI, I think the interesting stories are how are they working with the CEOs, how are they working with the boards, and going out to the other sandboxes and learning more about the greater and wider implications of AI when it comes to geopolitical risk, when it comes to harm in their communities, and what new, speaking to policymakers so they understand when they're trying to put together prioritize their risk reports, what are all the legal implications, and staying up and staying abreast of all these things.
Interesting, Rachel. There's a question here for you, Roger, around the Gen AI ingesting previously produced Gen AI content. So calling it the model collapse.
Kind of death loop of hallucination. Yeah, it's a thing. It eats itself. And one of the few sort of breaks on that currently is that I think it's OpenAI who are behind ChatGPT currently have a break on 2 years. So if I may be wrong in this, correct me if I am, but I think they say nothing is ingested that is less than 2 years old. So that's a sort of designed in circuit breaker to prevent it eating itself like that. But I'm quite sure that we're going to see, and again, just back to the general point I made at the beginning, this is not just propagating bias, it is amplifying it. So it's taking pre-existing things like stereotyping, things like confirmation bias, the tendency to look for facts that confirm your existing position. Things like, we haven't even talked about delusions of competence or the Dunning-Kruger effect, which I'm sure many of your members will be familiar with. The idea that as a novice, you feel confident about something and you do it and nothing goes wrong. So you keep on doing it, but actually you don't have the expert knowledge that you need to make the decision. Again, I think that's very characteristic of where generative AI is sitting right now. And I think the other thing is short-termism. So this idea of sort of self-reproducing death loops or echo chambers, whatever you want to say, particularly where that is amplifying bias over a short time scale, whether it's a financial year or an electoral cycle. One of the big issues of governance generally, and I know, Carolyn, your institute has looked at this, is the question of cycles of appointment and tenures of people in governance positions. Actually, Andrea was just referring to that. One of the good things we've done in finance is put in a circuit breaker so that non-execs, for example, have to come up for review at much shorter intervals. You don't get these long-serving people who are sort of there by default and just saying yes to everything. There's a lot more active challenge. One of the big success, maybe unwritten success stories in financial regulation over the last 5 years is how much more effective non-executive challenge to over-powerful or overconfident executives now is. Problem is, I think the machine learning is still sort of basing itself on older models and is not putting in these circuit breakers that it needs.
Here heard quite a bit, and really it all boils down to that concept that you touched on, Roger, and you emphasized, Andrea, on this integrated governance. So We've heard about how the board needs to be better equipped to deal with this new phenomenon and understand how to guide it and direct it. We understand now in terms of the board's decision-making, guidance, direction should go throughout the organization and not be, that unknown, unheard that's sitting at the higher echelons. That actually the person working at the front desk needs to know about that direction setting and buy into it. So it's almost a culture of governance throughout the organization. We've heard about how the risks and opportunities need to change and need to be far more considerate of what's happening around the organization. And Rachel spoke about the different sandpits. And we spoke about how the various the compliance side of things and how that's very, retrospective and possibly not as proactive as it needs to be. So we need to put controls on that in terms of, we can do many things, but should we? And we have to put our own controls in place. And Andrea, you emphasized the importance of ethics in this whole environment. I think the one thing that hasn't come through for me, and Rachel, I'm going to look to you because you're from ACCA, in terms of the audit and the assurance side of things. Now, we know that that's one area where a lot of people are talking about using AI for audits. And we've already had, the computer-assisted audit techniques for many years now. But how is AI going to impact audit? And does a board need to be circumspect when AI is being used by internal audit or by the external auditors? Or will they have to even disclose that they're using this?
Yes, they'll have to disclose that they're using us. But I've been in forums where we talk about how AI is going to actually be robots on boards, or the auditor themselves will be, and what are the implications of those? I mean, I think that our members on the audit side are actually very optimistic about how it can change their role and help them better detect things before they happen, kind of thing, if you like, and make organizations more prepared. We're also seeing so many interesting stories about how people work together across the 3 lines, or how the roles and responsibilities are rewritten for them. And we've already heard before about the 1A, 2A, 1B, 2B kind of relationships and how those evolve. But we're seeing lots of new types of roles created. Maybe someone moving from the first or second line to the third line being more of a stewardship. So where they're not just thinking about root causes, they're thinking about, okay, well, we've seen this before, what does that mean now? And so on the positive side, I think, they're using it to help them develop that more of critical thinking.
Brilliant. I know we're out of time and I need to hand over to Alan just to close the colloquium, but in the last couple of minutes that we have, maybe just last words. And if Roger, I can start with you. What is the key message that you would like to leave with us about generative AI in terms of the risks and opportunities for an organization?
I think it's actually a life story message from my own work. So I trained as an auditor with a classic Big Four audit firm. One of the things that fascinated me about that work, that still fascinates me today as a behavioral researcher, is this ability to ask people challenging questions, to put them outside their comfort zone a little bit and challenge their frame of reference. And I think the role of the audit profession and the role of the governance layer, very consonant here in questioning truths, foraging for, is this the true quality information we need to make a robust decision? So critical thinking, and I think critical thinking is the skill which the audit profession and a well-informed governance layer, and particularly the NEDs, the independent challenge function in any organization, can bring to this. And if that is sufficiently, done with sufficient energy, then I think we can kind of rope in this monster called generative AI, and actually it will be a force for good. I'm not optimistic right now, but it is within our grasp if we make that effort.
There are lots of people who are going to come and claim their money, I see on the chat. You promised there was going to be a disaster.
Yeah,
hit me up on LinkedIn and we'll have a conversation.
Yeah.
I saw a few of those were ACCA members, I see too.
Andrea, some last words from your side?
Yeah, so I haven't talked about this much throughout our 3 hours together, but and there's an article that I wrote that's short and sweet for World Economic Forum on how to build organizational resilience in the face of this, onslaught of new tech. And it's a model that has 8 steps that I developed in a book that I wrote a few years ago, and I've used it for a number of different things. I've applied it to cybersecurity, and it's basically 8 steps to gaining organizational resilience. I did it for cybersecurity, and in this article, I do it for generative AI. And it's very simple and very common sense, but people don't always do simple and common sense. And it starts with governance and leadership and tone from the top. It continues with culture. It continues then with knowing your stakeholders. And this is something we haven't talked about either. Knowing who your most important stakeholders are and their expectations of you on this topic. It then continues with risk intelligence, which incorporates the whole risk audit loop, really, in terms of enterprise risk management, knowing what to audit, what to check. It goes to strategy, and then it goes to performance metrics and crisis preparedness, which we haven't talked about that much either, and incorporating some of these Gen AI scenarios into your scenario planning, into your crisis management preparedness, et cetera. And the last step in this 8-step loop is incorporating lessons learned, root cause analysis, continuous improvement, all things that audit teams really do well and really contribute in terms of the organization, bringing that into your organization and creating more resilient and better products and services that are more ethical, that are more guardrailed, et cetera, et cetera. So take a look at that article because it gives you that thumbnail sketch. And I think we need to apply this kind of systems thinking to this onslaught of exponential tech. And that's where I'll leave it.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Last words from you, Rachel, and then I'll hand over to Alan.
Yes,
and you're on mute. There we go.
Yes, I mean, I think there are so many things that we didn't touch on, but I think plenty of food for thought for everyone to take away. And just on that focus on the role of the board, I do want, from my 2 cents, to end that I think, the duty of being on a board and in the privilege and the responsibilities are really in the spotlight today, given all of the risks and opportunities, as we say, they are being faced with. And I think us in the governance field of ACCA working with the Good Governance Academy and having great panelists like this we must emphasize, what these kind of being transparency and where we instill accountability, how important that is to these rapid green and digital transformations. And, I put in the G20 new revisions because if you really do read in there is a lot that I hope government and policymakers do try to emphasize about, why is someone being appointed? Why is someone, what are the succession planning? Learning more about who they are in terms of their personalities, because how will that impact their decisions when it comes to these existential risks? And I think, time and time again, we have seen when there is proof of loads of people who went to the same university being on the board and making the same decisions, the company isn't actually moving in the right direction. So I really think my message to everyone out there is to think about, and I know, Andrea, you've said this before, who are your leaders? Take more interest in that. What kind of leaders do you want to have? And there must be much, much more emphasis about getting the right kind of people representing all the different stakeholders. And again, I'll mention ageism. Lastly, a lot of positive stories in our research in the last few years have been companies that have not set up a sustainability board committee or an AI board committee. The ones that are really in the right direction and changing the necessary mindsets are the ones that have these shadow boards or task force on certain types of their sustainability matters or certain type of their AIs that they think matter to their line of business, say in banking, where a task force that includes everyone up and down the chain. Because the thing about culture is, you're the tone from the top adage, but actually it's all about both top down and bottom up.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Rachel. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much for spending time with us today. Your precious time and valuable time has been really fabulous listening to you. And I'd like to hand over to Alan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Caroline. I'm going to pick up on your word fabulous, because this was indeed a fabulous colloquium. And although we've been together for almost 3 hours, such is the interest of our participants, I'm sure we could have gone on for a little longer. I was checking the stats. We started with just over 450, and I think we're ending with just under 400. So that shows how much interest there has been in today's topic. Let me therefore start by thanking all of you for joining us today, for your questions, to the panel for sharing your thoughts and your experiences in the chat. Of course, I'd like to thank Rachel, Andrea, and Roger for spending so much time, not just today, but also all the time you spent prior to today in preparing for today's colloquium, and of course, being on the panel for such an important discussion. I would also, of course, like to recognize the tremendous effort and work of Caroline, our CEO, for her tireless work over many years leading the GA with limited resources, by the way, and the significant impact that this is having right across the world. Of course, none of this would have been possible without the vision and the passion of our patron, Mervyn King, who established the GA and started the Colloquia just, I think, over 4 years ago. Mervyn, you've been a leading light on focusing the world on important and good governance and ethical and effective leadership, both in the public sector, but also, importantly, right across the corporate world. I've been personally inspired by your passion, and this helps me every day to hold myself to the highest standard of ethical behavior. A lot of ethical behavior comments were made today, and it helps me to discharge my responsibilities in the corporate sector, both as an executive in the past and today as a non-executive director. Today, we've had an excellent engagement on this important topic, which I hope will help shape the future of our society. We clearly need to enhance governance everywhere. This has come out right across the conversation over the last 2.5 years. There is still much to do to enhance the scrutiny of boards and those charged with governance. And as Mervyn often says, responsibility, not abdication. So we know that we get the best outcomes when knowledge is shared, created and shared in diverse settings where on the board there is a broad representation of society. This is the point Rachel has just made, sitting around the table. We need to ensure that we continue to attract the younger generation and ensuring that their insights and their views shape both public and corporate policies. Because the next generation will be significantly benefiting from and impacted by generative IT. So we need them to be part of conversations today as we navigate our way to get the full value of AI. At the start of the colloquium, 52% of you said you do not use AI. Hopefully, after today's session, you will have the curiosity and probably the courage, hopefully, to explore how AI can assist you to create sustainable value in society. For example, I noted from Chisholm Abiudu, I think he works in the UN because he made a lot of reference to the UN. He or she, sorry, I shouldn't assume, that had used it secretly. Interestingly, I hope, Chisholm, you will now not keep this a secret going forward and share it openly, because you made some very important comments throughout the conversation today. We've heard from our panel about the importance of governance, about ethics, bias, and discrimination. I heard Roger use the word metacognition, ensuring no harm to individuals and to society, ensuring that regulators, leaders, and regulations do not stay behind the curve, i.e., not responding to the last catastrophe, as I heard said, recognizing what you do not know, making sure we continue to skill and reskill ourselves and avoid false correlations and false positives. There was mention of seeking forgiveness, not permission. Well, I would also like to add to this. I would mention the concept of comply or explain that I read a lot about. I hope that we get to the concept of comply and explain. I don't think it should be either or. Why should we not comply with good regulation and laws? If they're good, if they're not good, we should be part of making sure that they're better. And on this, I agree with one of our participants, Samantha Gutu, that organizations must do the right thing, whether regulations exist or not. It is, as has been said by a panelist, about the right culture right across the organization. It was clear from our participants that your concerns on Gen AI focus on privacy, insufficiency of internal controls, and the erosion of management skills, and, interestingly, the compromise of public trust and governance. And if you remember, I did start by saying trust in governance and the public is eroding rather fast. We need to do something to address that. You are also concerned about ignoring social harms, manipulated decision framing, and content. There were so many chats across this colloquium today, and the links added by Caroline as we were going through, that I hope we can save and share these widely. We are all learning from each other, and we should continue to do so. Finally, I do hope that Roger loses his bet that there will be a significant AI disaster by the end of 2025. However, this is something that we really must all be aware of and conscious of that could happen. So in the limited time we all have until 2025, we must all work hard to do everything possible to prevent this. So finally, Caroline, thank you so much for preparing this colloquium today. This is the 10th. I know we're looking forward to hearing from you about what the 11th will be in May next year, and of course, the 12th in November next year. But for now, I thank everyone for taking part, for your interest in what the GGA does. Please continue to sort of follow what we do, contribute to what we do, because none of us individually has all of the answers, but collectively we probably do. So thank you very much. Good evening or good night to some of you. Good evening to some of you, good afternoon, and maybe even good morning to those that joined from the other side of the Atlantic. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to open and close today's colloquium, and it's also a pleasure to be the chair of the Good Governance Academy. Thank you very much.